Verdict Form B. We, the jury, find the defendant Daniel Villegas not guilty of...
It's more powerful than facts. You can't give up. You gotta fight. Even if you go to your grave, you have got to fight.
It's hard to kind of hold on to hope, but hope is a very powerful word.
And the question has always been, was anybody listening?
When 16-year-old David McCallum was arrested for killing a man in 1985, he insisted he was not guilty. His pleas fell on deaf ears, and one coerced confession and rushed investigation later, he had been behind bars for 28 years, 11 months, and 12 days.
I heard 3 shots. I heard a shot first. I heard 1 shot. And then I heard 2 more shots.
After Willie fired the gun the first time, did he fire any other shots after that?
No, only heard 1 shot.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Nobody will talk to us, though, and it's really frustrating. What happened to Nathan was so awful that I understand now why no one wants to revisit the past. Every single part of this whole thing is infuriating. Buddha's dead. His partner's dead.
Willie's dead.
Willie's dead.
David's lawyer's dead.
David's lawyer's dead. Everything just feels like a waste of time, but it's like, what else are you supposed to do?
It's hard to kind of hold on to hope, but hope is a very powerful word.
The story is not without its insane twists. But what really happened? How did he end up in jail? What helped him be free? In October 1985, 20-year-old Nathan Blenner was kidnapped outside his home in Queens, New York. Nathan Blenner had just started his car and was getting ready to go when, according to eyewitnesses, 2 African-American men approached him and said, "Move the f*** over." The 2 men pushed him into the car and drove off. The day after Nathan Blenner was kidnapped, his body was found in Aberdeen Park in Brooklyn. There was a single fatal bullet wound in his head. His car had been burned and abandoned in an empty lot. When investigating the murder of Nathan Blenner, police canvassed the neighborhood. One woman told them that she was washing a car about a block away an hour before the crime. She said 2 black men walked by and one complimented her car. But when she looked through the police book of mugshots, she didn't identify anyone. Detectives were able to narrow it down to 2 suspects, Terrence Hayward and Herman Mumford, who had been brought in during an investigation into carjackings in Brooklyn. Police questioned them about the Blenner case, but they denied their involvement. But Hayward told the detective that he knew a 16-year-old kid named Willie Stuckey who claimed his gun had a body on it. So the police arrested Stuckey and his friend David McCallum. David McCallum and Willie Stuckey, who were both 16 years old in 1985, were placed in custody for the murder. Although they were minors, they were mostly interrogated without a parent present.
"Do you have a son by the name of David McCallum?" And I said, "Yes." "Where is he?" They said, "We have him at the precinct." So I said, "Well, he's only 16. I say, he need one of his parents there." He said, "If you come, you can't see him."
Hours of interrogation were not recorded, which lent to the fact that their confessions were coerced. The only thing that was truly recorded was their confession, which served as the only piece of evidence in the case.
Oh, okay, Mr. McCallum. You have the right to remain silent. That is, you do not have to speak to me or answer any of my questions. Do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
Anything you say to me can be used as evidence against you in a court of law. Do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
Now that I've advised you of your rights, do you want to speak to me about what happened?
Yes. We had brought the man in through the exit of Aberdeen Park and took him through the back.
Okay.
My friend,
Let me start you from earlier in the day.
During the interrogation, the detective in charge, Joseph Buddha, mostly fed McCallum details. As a scared African-American 16-year-old in New York, a city where there were gangs, gun violence, and hard drugs, all McCallum could do was agree. McCallum and Stuckey first put the blame on each other before eventually confessing. In 1985, New York City recorded almost 1,400 murders. The police were up to their necks with cases, and the people were fed up. This was the backdrop of the Nathan Blenner case, which eventually led to a confession.
Okay, so we got off the train in Queens, and there was this parked car, and there was this man sitting in it. Well, he stuck the gun to the car window and told the man to get out. So the man got out, And we had got in, and he told the man to get back in, so he got back in. And then the guy asked us where we was going. He said we was going for a little ride.
McCallum would later reveal that he added a lot of details to his confession, thinking that it would make it believable. Little did the 16-year-old know that it would cost him 16 years of his life.
What you doing? He just told the guy, you know what time it is. Then he clicked, and then the gun went off, and then the guy fell, and he was laying on the ground. In his arms, he was moving his arms, and then we had left.
McCallum was not the only one who confessed. 16-year-old Willie Stuckey also confessed to the crime. One important point to remember is that their confessions were different and inconsistent. Also, both said that Blenner was shot at night, but the medical examiner stated that Blenner was shot during the day, soon after the abduction. But the detectives ignored this fact and pushed forward with them as the perpetrators.
Before we got off the block, I gave him the gun.
He had the gun, Willie Stuckey, he had the gun on him at all times.
I heard 3 shots. I heard a shot first, I heard 1 shot, and then I heard 2 more shots.
After Willie fired the gun the first time, did he fire any other shots after that?
No, only heard 1 shot.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
The detectives had slapped Stuckey and McCallum when they recanted their confessions. McCallum also stated that the detectives threatened to hit him with a chair. Although they recanted their confessions after, Stuckey and McCallum were still found guilty. They were sentenced to 25 years to life imprisonment for second-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, first-degree robbery, and criminal use of a weapon. There was no physical evidence, no forensic data, and no witnesses. Only the inconsistent confessions of 2 coerced teenagers. David McCallum was born in 1969 in South Carolina. He grew up in Brooklyn in a big Southern family. McCallum was the third of 7 brothers and sisters. When he was 8 years old, his family moved to New York City. It was a culture shock for him, especially with how noisy the streets were. As a kid, he always wanted to be a hero, but it was a rough neighborhood, and he ended up being exposed to violence. The day that McCallum was arrested seemed like any other day. He played handball with his friends and went home for dinner. Suddenly, he was a criminal. Willie Stuckey was born in 1970 and grew up in Brooklyn, New York. He was a close friend of David McCallum. Stuckey spent over 16 years in prison. In December 2001, at the age of 31, he passed away in prison. The cause of his death was a heart attack, and there were some complications from an untreated ulcer. Apparently, Stuckey had repeatedly sought medical attention for his condition. This raised a lot of concerns about medical care in prison.
How were you able to maintain a sense of hope even at such an early age?
It's hard to kind of hold on to hope, but hope is a very powerful word.
David McCallum never expected that he'd get the guilty verdict, which was probably why he rejected the plea deal, offering 15 years to life in return for a guilty plea. 1 year after his incarceration, he found books that taught him how to write an appeal. But he was a high school dropout without a lawyer, so his appeals were wasted. 8 years later, he and Stuckey had exhausted all their appeals. By 2001, Stuckey died in prison, and McCallum continued to file legal challenges against his conviction. He was continually unsuccessful. After 25 years, in 2010, McCallum was eligible for parole. Although leaving prison through parole would mean admitting that he committed the crime in the first place, he applied each year and was repeatedly denied. One person who was helping McCallum prove his innocence was Ray Klonsky, a Toronto-based documentary filmmaker. But before he was a filmmaker, he was a pen pal who exchanged letters with McCallum. Klonsky's father was worried that he was going astray, so he decided to connect him with an inmate in prison, hoping that McCallum could set him straight. What he didn't know was that they would become close friends instead.
Dear Ray, hello and how are you? I met your dad nearly 2 years ago after reading an interview he conducted with Reuben Hurricane Carter. Me and your dad have become really good friends, and I was hoping that we too can become friends. I was around your age when I came to prison. I really want to write to you, and I often thought about the privilege of writing to his son.
As their friendship grew, Klonsky worked hard to find any new evidence that could prove McCallum's innocence. He visited the victim's family, Stuckey's family, and people in the neighborhood who knew McCallum in 1985. Klonsky also tried to track down the 2 witnesses who saw Nathan Blenner get taken away, who were 11 years old at the time, but with no luck. Also, many of the people who worked on the case in 1985, like Detective Joseph Buda, had passed away.
Hey, David. I'm out here doing everything I can for you. Nobody will talk to us though, and it's really frustrating. What happened to Nathan was so awful that I understand now why no one wants to revisit the past.
Every single part of this whole thing is infuriating.
Who
Buddha's dead. His partner's dead.
Willie's dead.
Willie's dead.
David's lawyer's dead.
David's lawyer's dead. Everything just feels like a waste of time, but it's like, what else are you supposed to do?
Year after year, McCallum and Klonsky wrote letters. Then Klonsky decided to record the documentary titled David and Me, along with Mark Lamy of Markham Street Films. The documentary was meant to show the inconsistencies of the case and campaign for the release of McCallum. As McCallum exchanged letters with Klonsky, he continued to live his life in prison while looking for a way to prove his innocence along with his lawyer. And that was when he found out about Reuben Carter. Reuben Hurricane Carter was a wrongful convict of 19 years. If anything, 3 weeks before Carter was released from prison, after serving 19 years on a triple murder he didn't commit, McCallum and Stuckey were arrested for the murder of Nathan Blenner. Carter was a former boxer and wrongful convictions advocate and inspiration of the Academy Award-nominated film The Hurricane, where he was played by Denzel Washington. Carter founded the Association for the Wrongly Convicted and Innocence International. In February 2004, McCallum read an interview written by Ken Klonsky, Ray's father, and sent a letter to Carter. When Carter replied to his letter, McCallum broke down in tears, even if there was no guarantee that he'd help. At least someone was willing to hear him out. This was way more than what he'd gotten since 1985, as he'd written about 600 letters asking for help. In November 2004, Carter visited McCallum in prison. McCallum's case was the first that Carter took on after founding Innocence International.
From teaching and managed to get Reuben Carter on board to help with the case. Reuben's star power helped attract Oscar Michelin, a lawyer who had successfully fought some other wrongful conviction cases in New York.
For years, Carter was also working on finding evidence to exonerate McCallum. In February 2014, while he was on his deathbed, he wrote a letter to District Attorney Kenneth P. Thompson. He said, "My single regret in life is that David McCallum is still in prison. Knowing what I do, I'm certain that when the facts are brought to light, Thompson will recommend his immediate release." He published his dying wish in the New York Daily. By April 2014, he passed away, unable to fulfill his wish of getting McCallum's innocence proven. But his dying wish was one of the factors that propelled the reinvestigation into McCallum's case. The journey to McCallum's exoneration started with the intervention of Reuben Carter. He attracted Oscar Michelin, who became Callum's pro bono lawyer.
Concluded that there was no physical evidence, no DNA evidence, no testimonial evidence.
Michelin asked the Kings County District Attorney Charles Hines to submit McCallum's case to the Conviction Integrity Unit. Afterward, DNA tests were performed on the marijuana roach and cigarette butts that were found in Blenner's car in 1985. Blenner had always banned smoking in his car, so they knew it wasn't his. McCallum or Stuckey's DNA was not found on these items. The DNA identified was that of a man with a criminal record. Michelin also investigated the police interrogation of Hayward and Mumford, which had not been disclosed to the defense attorneys during the initial trial. But by August 2013, Hines told Michelin that there was no evidence to support McCallum's innocence. By fall, Hines was replaced by Kenneth Thompson, the newly elected district attorney.
When I walked through the doors of this office in January, I inherited a legacy of disgrace with respect to wrongful conviction cases. We have over 100 of these cases to review.
This was a new chance for McCallum, as Michelin immediately sent him a letter asking him to get some fresh eyes on the case.
I made a pledge to the people of Brooklyn, and my pledge was to put the guilty away, but also to make sure that our criminal justice system was based on fundamental fairness.
Then, in 2014, before he passed away, Carter sent a letter as a dying wish to Thompson, asking him to review McCallum's case. All of these got McCallum's case to the top of the list among hundreds. In June of 2014, McCallum was informed that his case was now under investigation, and soon he was able to get his day in court, where his lawyer presented the truth of the case.
There is no evidence whatsoever that connects Mr. McCallum and Mr. Stuckey to the crime that was committed in this case, that these statements were not the voluntary recollection and admissions of the two defendants, but rather were the product of improper suggestion, improper inducement, and perhaps coercion.
By October 15, 2014, exactly 28 years, 11 months, and 12 days after McCallum and Stuckey were sent to prison, the court recognized the case for what it was, a flimsy murder rap. McCallum could not help but shed tears of joy and relief when the judge announced that the indictment was overturned. It had been 29 long years.
I will dismiss the indictment.
Walking out of prison was a bittersweet moment for David McCallum, especially since someone was missing, Willie Stuckey.
Feeling like I want to go home, finally, after 29 years. And of course, this is a bittersweet moment because I'm walking out alone. There's someone else, there's someone else who's supposed to be walking out with me, but unfortunately he's not, and that's Willie Stuckey.
Still, it was a cause for celebration for McCallum and Stuckey's families, as they had both been cleared of any wrongdoing.
Well, I mean, I've had a long time to think about that, and unfortunately. So, but at the same time, I think I'm mature enough to understand that I can't get that back, and I won't even attempt to get that back. I think my life kind of starts, from this point on.
Now that McCallum was out of prison, he couldn't wait to get back into society and reconnect with his family. Everyday activities that seemed like a chore for us were actually something he was excited about.
Just being able to be out of that place, and just being able to adapt to a place that I've left a long time ago, and just to come back into society again, and be able to spend a lot of time with my family and friends and those sorts of things, and do some of the things that I've often dreamed about when I was incarcerated. So just to have the opportunity to do those things now is definitely rewarding.
Have you got yourself a job yet?
Yes, I do, as a matter of fact. Yes.
What you got?
Well, right now I'm working for the Manhattan Legal Aid Society. So I work for the Juvenile Rights Division. I'm a support staff member. So haven't been at the job for a little over 6 months now, and I have to say that I really enjoy doing what I'm doing. It's a very rewarding work for me, and just to be able to get up in the morning and go to work every morning, for me, it's just a thrill.
McCallum came back to society and was met with a different world where he did not understand the concept of the internet or smartphones.
Have you ever used a smartphone?
No, I have not.
Do you have one now?
Yes, I do.
So what's that like, trying to learn how old are you now, David?
I am 46 years old.
So you're 46 and you are using a smartphone for the first time in your life. What's that like?
Wow, it's actually frustrating, confusing, exciting, all those things wrapped into one. I think for me, technology, it's always evolving. So I have this phone for basically a little over a year now. And I'm still trying to figure out how to navigate certain systems on the phone. But for me, I think because I have a pretty good support system, a lot of good family and friends to kind of help me around and show me some things, and even colleagues at work been able to share some of their expertise with me, so to speak. So I think from the standpoint of learning technology, it's been pretty eventful, but at the same time, as I said earlier, it's also been very frustrating too. But you know what? I'm not going to complain, Steve, because I'd rather have these are good problems in my opinion. So.
Upon his release, McCallum also filed a $50 million lawsuit against the estate of Detective Joseph Buddha, who died of cancer in 1994. Buddha's widow, Lorraine, was named as the defendant in the lawsuit. He also filed a claim for compensation with the New York Court of Claims. He ended up receiving $3.7 million. Meanwhile, Willie Stuckey's mother, Rosia Smith Stuckey, also filed a claim for $2 million as compensation in the capacity of administrator of his estate. But that was simply a small price to pay for the years that the justice system had taken away from these men. Meanwhile, let's not forget about the case that started all of this in the first place. In 1985, Nathan Blenner was carjacked, robbed, and murdered. And his entire family was led to believe that those responsible were McCallum and Stuckey. Now that their convictions have been overturned, the question remains, who is the true perpetrator? Although the investigators had found DNA on the items in Blenner's car, they have still been unable to point out who murdered him in 1985. Blenner's family has said that they now feel like an unfortunate afterthought as Blenner's photo doesn't show up on a Google image search. As McCallum entered his new beginning and Stuckey missed the chance to have his, Blenner's family was back at square one seeking justice for Nathan. His sister Deborah said, "In the end, the statement is the killers are still out there. That's how you leave the room." The murder case of Nathan Blenner was one that eventually became complicated, roping in 2 innocent men for 29 years due to the poor investigation practices by 2 detectives in 1985. McCallum and Stuckey thought that they'd never see the outside of the prison walls, and at the end of the day, only one of them did. McCallum might have missed out on almost 3 decades of his life, but with his great support system, he has found a new place to start from and is now working towards getting the best of his life today. Stuckey's family was devastated that he'd passed away in prison, but at least they were able to overturn his conviction, making him a free man. And Blenner's family is back to the beginning, confused about Nathan's case and wondering who was the murderer. How has he stayed hidden all these years? And would he ever be found? There's no doubt that many years have passed, and the poor investigation from 1985 led to a ripple effect that left many stuck. Still, McCallum's story is a sign that hope was not lost. What do you think about the exoneration of David McCallum? Do you think the real killer will ever be found? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
Satanic cults. Satanic ritual abuse has become the fastest growing and most controversial psychological phenomenon in the country.
This case is probably the last gasp of the satanic ritual abuse panic. Allegations were made that 4 young women had these 2 little girls.
During the week of July 24th to 31st, 1994, 4 friends and recently outed lesbians, 19-year-old Ana Vasquez, 19-year-old Cassandra Rivera, 20-year-old Elizabeth Ramirez, and 21-year-old Christy Mayhew, were hanging out at Elizabeth's apartment. They were tasked with babysitting Elizabeth's 7 and 9-year-old nieces for the week. But everything crashed down when Elizabeth's nieces returned home and shared a disturbing story about Elizabeth and her friends allegedly forcing themselves on them. To many, homosexuality was considered a sin back then, and coupled with such an allegation, it became something even more terrible in their minds. If you don't recall the nationwide panic in the US during the 1980s and 90s, wild theories about people engaging in disturbing satanic practices, including blood drinking, child sacrifice, and sexual abuse, spread like wildfire. It was in this era of satanic panic that the urgent investigation ensued. However, it would take decades for the real truth to emerge. So what was the truth? Did Elizabeth and her friends really commit these crimes? Or were they the new victims caught in the grip of this widespread hysteria? In the 1980s and early 1990s, the United States was living in the terror of mass hysteria. Since this process was termed as therapy, rogue imagination and intrusive thoughts were considered as real, long-forgotten memories. But if you think this was a bad situation, you'll be shocked by what happened next. When these incidents sparked attention, children were subjected to suggestive questioning and from there started a different kind of panic altogether. The terror didn't remain hidden behind closed doors anymore. Police and social workers started getting involved. The children told the authorities about being taken out on boats to watch babies being pitched into the ocean to be devoured by sharks, or babies being killed so adults could drink their blood. Everyone was scared, and this phenomenon came to be known as the Satanic Panic. During the week of July 24th to 31st, 1994, 4 friends, 19-year-old Ana Vasquez, 19-year-old Cassandra Rivera, 20-year-old Elizabeth Ramirez, and 21-year-old Christy Mayhew were spending time at Elizabeth's apartment. They were also babysitting Elizabeth's 7 and 9-year-old nieces to take care of. The 4 friends often spent time at each other's places. They didn't know that during one such normal get-together, they would lose everything. Unlike what you hear in our regular stories, no kidnapping, murder, or robbery ever happened. Everyone continued living their lives, just like they had been after that week with the kids. In the meantime, Elizabeth was now 4 months pregnant and had been promoted to manager position at Arby's. That day in the fall of 1994, she was back at home from her shift when she heard a knock at the door. The man at the door introduced himself as Detective Thomas Macheca from the Homicide Unit of San Antonio Police Department. The first question anyone would think of would be, who died? The answer was nobody. But Detective Macheca was at the right place. He was investigating this crime, and he needed some answers from Elizabeth, who agreed to help him out in any way she could. Detective Macheca asked her if she knew someone named Javier Limon. Elizabeth knew him. Javier was her sister Rosemary's ex-boyfriend. Rosemary and Javier had 2 daughters together, the same 7- and 9-year-old nieces that Elizabeth babysat with her friends about a month prior. He explained that her nieces had told them the truth about that week. Elizabeth didn't understand what could be so extraordinary about that week. That's when she was told that both of her nieces had complained of sexual assaults from Elizabeth and her friends. Javier's older daughters said that initially everything was fine and even fun. One afternoon, Elizabeth and her friends had been drinking tequila. They were tipsy, yes, but Javier's daughters said that they were topless also. In fact, she mentioned that there were some liquids and powders as well. Then Elizabeth called her older niece into the bedroom and screamed at her until the remaining 3 women in the apartment held her down and started kissing her. In the word of Javier's 9-year-old daughter, the 4 women started putting cold liquid stuff inside her. Then they proceeded to insert a tampon into her private area. At that moment, Javier called Elizabeth to talk to his daughters. She took out a gun and held it to her niece's head. That 9-year-old girl took this gesture as a sign to pretend everything was fine, and that's exactly what she told her father. Javier didn't suspect a thing and hung up. But the torture was not over yet. She was ordered to take a shower, but when they reached closer to the bathroom, she could hear her younger sister scream from inside. She was trying to get out, but the door had been locked. Detective Macheca told her that it wasn't looking good for her and that she was going to be arrested. Elizabeth didn't share this news with all her friends yet, but she had told Anna. So when in September 1994, Cassandra and Anna were out at a park and Anna suddenly started engaging in PDA, it seemed unusual. They weren't allowed to be so public with their love and affection. Cassandra could sense something wasn't right. When she was trying to understand what was different with her partner that morning, Anna slipped up. She said she didn't care what others were going to say or think because she had so little time left. Anna was certainly not going to die, not really. Cassandra prodded her for answers, and that's when Anna finally expressed how Elizabeth was going to jail for sexual assault. But that wasn't all. Cassandra, Anna, and their friend Christy were also being accused. The way Christy found this out was even more dramatic. She was at her mother's apartment in Rosenberg outside Houston. The police surrounded her building and asked her to come out. At this point, it looked like all 4 of them would be going to jail together. Life was difficult for these women even before these allegations came along. And now, the world was crashing down on all 4 of them. In March 1995, the 4 women faced charges of aggravated assault of a child. They turned down offers to admit guilt for shorter punishments of 10 years and went to trial. During her legal problems, Elizabeth delivered her son. She was still producing milk when the police arrested her and took her to jail, separating her from her newborn. The arresting officers would not even let her kiss him goodbye. In early February 1997, in Bexar County Criminal District Court, Elizabeth sat at the defendant's table as the judge listed the charges against her: aggravated sexual assault of a child and indecency with a child. Sitting in the courtroom, Elizabeth's older niece did not behave the way she anticipated. When Elizabeth entered the courtroom, the girl accusing her of abuse waved and smiled at her. But the prosecutor, Philip Kazan, had a solid theory in place already. He told the jury that Elizabeth had held a 9-year-old girl up as a sacrificial lamb to her friends. Elizabeth's lawyer, Freddie Ruiz, attempted to convince Elizabeth's older niece to state that she was confused and that the gun had actually been held by her father, Javier, in Colorado. Javier had threatened Rosemary with a gun years before in Denver, and this memory had somehow included Elizabeth in the child's mind. Javier Limon was in the spotlight during this whole trial. He was working as a heavy equipment operator for the city of San Antonio while dating Rosemary. He said Elizabeth would call him for rides and small amounts of cash since she didn't have a car. The kids liked Elizabeth, so he allowed them to stay at her apartment even after he separated from Rosemary. Javier mentioned that after the girls spent the week at Elizabeth's in July 1994, he didn't notice anything different initially. Then, one day while he was at work, his mother, Serafina Limon, was cooking when the girls were playing outside. One of the girls ran in and told her that the other had been playing with dolls in an inappropriate way, undressing them and making them kiss. When Serafina asked her how they got to know about it, the girls told her the entire story. The expert witness for the prosecution was a doctor named Nancy Kellogg, a professor of pediatrics at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio, who said she had examined around 3,500 sexual assault victims, with the majority of them being children. Dr. Kellogg had examined both of Elizabeth's nieces. During that examination, she noticed a 2 to 3 millimeter healed scar on the hymen, a scar normally caused by penetration. In her notes, Kellogg guessed that the acts were related to Satanism. Although she could not conclusively say how that scar came to be, she insisted that it was related to abuse. Elizabeth spoke in her own defense while on the witness stand. From here on, the entire trial was based on Elizabeth's sexuality. The prosecutor asked her if she was dating Christy or Cassandra. When she said no, Prosecutor Kazan said, "Well, maybe I'm confused. I thought you said that if you're gay and you were friends, that's a gay relationship." Just because they were gay didn't mean that day they engaged in an intimate relationship. And just because they were gay didn't mean that the friendship couldn't be platonic. In any case, the kind of relationship between 4 lesbian friends didn't signify pedophilia in any way. All 4 continued to profess their innocence. But if they didn't commit these crimes, where was all this coming from? Elizabeth suspected that it was Javier's doing. When she'd been living with Rosemary and Javier earlier, he seemed to have developed some feelings for her. He used to give Elizabeth rides, offer her small amounts of cash when she needed it, and leave long messages on her answering machine. After his messy breakup with Rosemary, he'd even started sending her love letters in which he referred to her as "my little angel." When Elizabeth became pregnant, Javier offered to marry her, but she turned down his offer just a few days before his daughters were supposed to spend time with her. Javier never accepted these allegations about making a move on Elizabeth. He said that the entire Ramirez family had plotted against him to justify the breakup between him and Rosemary. Javier's advances towards Elizabeth were confirmed by her family, but his denials found support among his own relatives. His contentious custody battle with his subsequent partner, Karina Hooper, was another case against him. She described Javier as hurtful, mean, a sociopath, accusing her son of sexual abuse and reporting her for neglect, leading to her son becoming a registered sex offender through a plea deal. She emphasized a pattern in Javier's behavior, which was very clear according to her. He used authorities to retaliate against those who crossed him. However, Javier's sister, Cristina Aguilar, presented a different perspective. She painted a picture of a man constantly entangled in relationships with women who exploited him. Now, to decide whether the crime happened or if it had been a figment of Javier's imagination and his ultimate master plan was left for the jury to decide. Lonnie Gentry, the jury foreman at Elizabeth's 1997 trial, heard Javier's older daughter describe what had happened to her. Gentry was a minister and had mentioned that he considered homosexuality a sin. It was difficult to find jury members who supported or were even neutral towards homosexuality. On February 6, 1997, they quickly found Elizabeth guilty, but the discussion about her punishment went on. The 37.5-year sentence was a middle ground between stricter and more lenient jurors. The foreman, Gentry, thought she should have received a life sentence. He believed that if it had been a man, there would not have been much debate. When the verdict was announced, her mother, Gloria, screamed. Elizabeth was only allowed 5 minutes to say goodbye to her family before she was escorted to a holding cell. But this was not the end yet. Cassandra, Anna, and Christy went to trial together a year later in February 1998 in the same Bexar County Criminal District Court. Some things were different in this trial. First of all, the identity of the younger niece was allowed to be revealed to the public. And secondly, she was even going to testify this time. The prosecutor, Mary Kay Devlin, informed the jury that much time had passed, so the victims might not remember everything perfectly. It had been about 3.5 years since the alleged abuse. It was Valentine's Day in 1998 when all 3, Cassandra, Anna, and Christy, were found guilty of the same crimes as Elizabeth. Each was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The women went to prison facing increased security levels. Cassandra spent over 30 days in solitary confinement for refusing sex offender rehabilitation classes. Elizabeth had never been in trouble with the law before, so she couldn't believe what was happening to her. The fear reached its peak when a prison officer paid an inmate to attack her in the shower during her time in county jail. Anna's mom, Maria, was with her throughout this entire ordeal. In fact, Maria had enough motherly love for all 4 of the girls. She took care of Anna, but also extended her support to the other girls. She drove 3 hours to spend 2 hours with her daughter, Anna, but she'd also visit the other girls. She'd occasionally go on 1-hour visits with Elizabeth and also travel to see Cassandra and Christy, bringing them little snacks during visitations. These snacks were a delightful treat, and her presence provided a boost, a sense of hope to all of them. She became the mother figure for all 4 women. Their families hired lawyers to appeal, but nothing was turning out to be helpful. Elizabeth's sister, Rosemary, had found work supporting courthouse cleaning. Every other day, she cleaned her sister's prosecutor's office, Philip Kazin, who was unaware of her identity.
I think about what my plans will be when I get out of prison, and I really don't have any clue. I don't know if I will be exonerated. I don't know if I'll have to register as a sex offender. So I try and take everything day by day.
In 2006, Darryl Otto, a biologist studying female sex offenders from the Yukon, learned about the case involving these women. Correspondence ensued. Letters were exchanged between Otto and Elizabeth, and Otto became convinced of her innocence. Initially skeptical, Otto repeatedly asked Stephanie, the younger niece, the same questions and letters to test the consistency of her answers. To his relief, they remained consistent. To gain a better understanding of her, Otto traveled to Texas. When Elizabeth appeared behind the glass to meet him, she couldn't stop shaking. At first, Anna was wary of Elizabeth's new friend, having witnessed Elizabeth struggling with the interests of men before. She believed this was also the case with Otto. While visiting her mother across the room, Anna would glare at Otto. However, her fears would turn out to be baseless. Otto discovered the National Center for Reason and Justice, an organization formed in response to the satanic ritual abuse scandals of the 1980s. In 2008, he sought assistance from the organization co-founded by Debbie Nathan, an author who had written a book about the satanic ritual abuse cases. They aimed to support individuals wrongly accused of harming children. Upon examining the case, Nathan took the case to the Innocence Project of Texas, where the renowned lawyer Jeff Blackburn decided to represent the women. However, progress was slow for about a year. Then, Mike Ware, another lawyer from the Innocence Project, stepped in. Nathan reached out to family members and other individuals linked to the case, while Otto actively sought reporters and even wrote a brief essay on Texas Monthly's website. Michelle Mondo, a crime reporter at the San Antonio Express-News, came across Otto's piece, sparking her interest. Mondo dedicated over a year to investigating the story, often working on it during her free time. Through her research, she uncovered that Javier's 2 daughters had previously made abuse allegations in Denver, only to claim during Elizabeth's trial that they couldn't recall doing so. The support network for the women was expanding. They came to be known as the San Antonio Four. Nathan persuaded filmmaker Deborah S. Esquenazi, whom she'd mentored, to examine the case. Following the publication of Mondo's story in 2010, Nathan interviewed the younger victim, Stephanie, who was now 23 years old. During the interview, Stephanie recanted her trial testimony, revealing that she and her sister had made false claims under pressure from their father, Javier Limon. Javier was not charged with anything because his older daughter still stuck to her original testimony. Over a decade later, in 2011, Cassandra moved to the Hobby Unit in Marlin, where Anna and Elizabeth were serving their respective sentences. Cassandra attended a Catholic Mass, spotting Elizabeth for the first time. Elizabeth had distanced herself from all of them. No one understood why she was behaving that way. But in reality, Elizabeth was racked with guilt. Meanwhile, Anna, tasked with maintenance duty, was assigned to fix lights in Cassandra's cell. When the 2 ex-partners crossed paths and saw each other for the first time, they were both shaking. Cassandra's son and daughter persisted in making the 3-hour drive up Interstate 35 to visit their mom in prison. In contrast, Elizabeth lost all communication with her son when he was just 5 years old, and custody was granted to his father. The prison routine seemed endless, prompting Elizabeth to create her own routine. Every Sunday, she'd compose a heartfelt letter to her son, entrusting her mother to deliver it. However, the years passed without receiving a response. In late 2012, the media's focus on the women was steadily increasing. Anna, one of the four, was granted parole in November of that same year.
I kind of froze it, because the words were kind of melting off. And he says, "Welcome home, Anna."
And I haven't seen her where I can be able to hug her because she's been behind the glass. So I'm gonna finally get to hug her, and I'm like, not gonna let her go. Okay, you're taking the blankets for her?
Yes.
In case she gets cold?
Yes.
Okay. So we're taking the blankets. I got everything in the car.
Okay, Bobby, knock out.
Okay.
No, Mom, I'm gonna throw a party.
Just make sure not to go in Anna's room.
Turn off the coffee.
Despite her release, she still carried the label of a convicted sex offender, subject to a strict set of parole rules. No cell phones, no computers, and no contact with anyone under 18. Though she initially worked at her brother's auto shop, she had to quit when they discovered its proximity to a school. About a year later, in September of 2013, a new state law came into effect, passed by the Texas legislature in the spring. This statute aimed to facilitate challenges to convictions grounded in outdated forensic evidence. So, in late October of that year, attorney Mike Ware took action by filing writs for all four women. The San Antonio 4 case emerged as one of the initial tests for this new law. Dr. Kellogg informed the Bexar County District Attorney's Office that her original claims during the trial were outdated, and she would not provide the same testimony today. IPTX filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus on behalf of the four women. Kellogg's acknowledgement unexpectedly weakened the crucial evidence in the case. District Attorney Susan Reed concurred that the women could be granted release on bond, allowing for additional legal proceedings in the spring. However, she decided not to pursue a retrial, and the women would be exempt from sex offender restrictions. Elizabeth's mother contacted her grandson to share the news that his mother would soon be released. The moment was finally here. It had been decades since the four women were thrown behind bars. Cassandra and Christy had spent 13 years in prison, while Elizabeth had been incarcerated for almost 17 years. So much had changed since then that Anna couldn't even grasp the point of an addiction to smartphones. Finally, the women were due to be released on bail on November 13, 2013. Family members had been waiting throughout the day for them to be released at the prison, but the sun was beginning to set and there were fears that something had gone wrong with their release. A friend was waiting outside with 10 outfits on hangers for the women to choose from. Finally, Elizabeth, Anna, Christy, Cassandra, and their lawyer, Mike Ware, came out of the prison holding hands in a line and raising their arms up in victory. The women were like celebrities now. Everyone knew who they were. This was another one of those moments they'd seen happening to others, but could never imagine it happening to them. Strangers would smile, greet, and congratulate them. People didn't let them pay for things. Technology had evolved so much during their stint in prison. However, the real shocker was that people, irrespective of their gender or sexuality, were allowed to kiss each other openly without any fear. On November 23, 2016, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals approved the writs and annulled the convictions of the four women. The court officially stated that the four women were completely innocent, exonerating them from all charges. As a result, the state of Texas granted compensation to each of them. Christy received $1,073,000. Elizabeth was awarded $1,346,000. Cassandra received $1,080,000, while Anna received $1,104,000. Cassandra was not just dealing with the pain of being wrongfully convicted. She'd been physically separated from her young children. She faced the difficult task of rebuilding her connection with her children after enduring the trauma of incarceration. Separated by glass during their growth, her children transformed from 8 and 9-year-olds into grown-up strangers. Yet through the challenge of learning to be loved again, the unbreakable bond of a mother's love prevailed. For Elizabeth, the true highlight came when her 18-year-old son visited, expressing love with a heartfelt hug. Despite the initial lack of connection, they rebuilt their relationship through movies, dinners, and countless conversations. Over time, they found themselves in a much better place. Presently, she fills her days caring for her grandkids and maintaining her own print shop, a skill she acquired during her time in prison. For Anna, her belief in justice was shaky now. Despite the conviction, she clung to the hope that truth would eventually prevail. Throughout this dark chapter, Anna found solace in her faith, the strength to forgive pain, and the support of her mother. Today, she serves as the Outreach and Education Director of the Innocence Project of Texas, sits on the San Antonio Crime Coalition Board, and has been appointed to the Board of Directors of the Houston Forensic Science Center by Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner. Upon release, her mother played a pivotal role in Anna's readjustment, providing emotional and financial support. In a reversal of roles, Anna is now her mother's caregiver, offering assistance due to her mother's back problems. This was truly a roller coaster of a case. The world has changed considerably now. A survey in 2015 found that 4% of the people in San Antonio and the surrounding areas identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. In 2016, San Antonio received a score of 90 out of 100 for how it treats the LGBT community. None of the 4 women held any grudges against the children, recognizing they were too young to grasp the situation. What's even more striking is that those little girls were coerced into memorizing answers, potentially causing them a lot of emotional and psychological harm. Despite feeling anger, Anna, Cassandra, Elizabeth, and Christy understood the importance of forgiveness to move forward, and that's precisely what they did. Given the context, how do you think the ongoing hysteria of the time aided Javier in his plans? Why didn't the older girl retract her statement? Please let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. This person was killed in a ghastly murder, and this person was arrested.
The hero and the coward both feel the same thing. But the hero uses this fear and projects it onto his opponent while the coward runs. This is the metaphor for all of us. Never let fear determine who you are. Never let where you come from determine where you are going.
In the story of Dewey Bozella, you'll discover the shocking twist, how the tables turned, leading to the arrest that no one saw coming. This dark transformation of a boxer's life would change everything. Dewey Bozella was born in 1959 in Coney Island, Brooklyn. He faced a challenging upbringing, which got worse in 1968 when he witnessed his father assault his pregnant mother so badly that she didn't survive. Following his mother's death, Dewey's father fled and never returned. To start afresh, Dewey and his 3 siblings moved to Poughkeepsie, Dutchess County, New York. After losing his mother, Dewey was raised in foster group care. However, life wasn't done with him. Dewey encountered further heartbreak with the loss of his brothers. One was stabbed to death, another shot and killed, and a third succumbed to AIDS. These experiences weighed Dewey down. However, despite the hardships, his resilience and strength shone through. Dewey had a remarkable determination and passion for boxing, which led him to train alongside the legendary former 2-time world heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson during his teenage years. His dedication to the sport mirrored his unwavering spirit in the face of adversity.
Oh, boxing my life. Boxing is what saved me. Boxing deals with morals, obligations, and responsibilities. And the main thing is discipline. It helped me to find that freedom I needed. That was my peace.
Although he loved boxing and wanted to turn his life around, he joined the wrong group and was arrested for petty stealing. However, fate had a more intense challenge for him. In June 1977, in Dutchess County, New York, a 92-year-old woman, Emma Crasper, returned home from a church event to find a burglar in her apartment. Initially, she was scared and tried to call for help, but the thief was faster and quickly closed her mouth. The situation escalated when the burglar assaulted her, bound her, and ultimately caused her death by stuffing linens down her throat, which eventually led to suffocation. Authorities initially suspected brothers Lamar and Stanley Smith, along with Dewey, due to his past minor run-ins with the law and his presence in the vicinity. Initially, the Smith brothers denied any involvement. However, their story changed during their interview when the police falsely informed them that Dewey had accused them of the crime. Under the pressure of this false accusation, Lamar went on to claim that he witnessed Dewey and another individual, Wayne Mosley, attempting a break-in on Emma's front porch. Stanley, on the other hand, stated he saw Dewey, Mosley, and a third man in a nearby park before the burglary. Despite Mosley and Dewey professing their innocence, the police named them as prime suspects. To secure testimony against Dewey, prosecutors offered Mosley immunity, including protection from perjury charges and a reduction of his existing jail sentence. To save his skin, Mosley accepted the offer, and at just 18, Dewey was charged with murder. In a series of legal twists, Mosley, along with Stanley and Lamar Smith, testified against Dewey during his trial. Their testimonies led to Dewey's conviction for second-degree murder on December 3, 1983, resulting in a sentence of 20 years to life. However, his first conviction was overturned due to the prosecutor's use of an authoritative mode to exclude black jurors during jury selection. Eventually, Dewey faced a retrial on December 13, 1990. Interestingly, before the trial, Dewey had rejected a plea bargain, maintaining his innocence. During the second trial, Stanley Smith refused to testify, retracting his previous statements. Additionally, Lamar also retracted his testimony. Despite this, the jury once again found Dewey guilty of second-degree murder, imposing the same 20-year-to-life sentence. Dewey was sent to the Sing Sing Correctional Facility in Ossington, New York, to serve his sentence. When he heard his sentence, he fell to the floor and started crying, screaming that he didn't do it. Throughout the court processes, Dewey maintained his innocence, denying any involvement in the alleged crimes, even during parole board hearings. His consistent claim of innocence led the parole board to deny him parole on 4 separate occasions. Although Dewey felt that he was being treated unjustly, he was determined to turn his life around. During his time behind bars, Dewey Bozella demonstrated remarkable resilience and determination. He achieved significant academic milestones, earning a bachelor's degree from Mercy College and a master's from New York Theological Seminary. In an unexpected turn of events, he found love and married Trina, the sister of another inmate. Despite the hardships, Dewey did not give up on his passion, but found a way back into boxing while being behind bars. He trained and fought in the very building that once housed Sing Sing's electric chair, now transformed into a boxing ring. His dedication to the sport shone through as he became the prison's light heavyweight boxing champion. Despite this, time was flying slowly for him inside the prison, and he was waiting for a big miracle. Months had turned into years. And it was 2007 now, and Dewey Bozella reached out to the Innocence Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to uncover wrongful convictions.
I have been writing this firm since 2001, and no one had answered my letters. So here I am writing again, asking for your help. I have for the past 26 years been fighting to prove my innocence.
The Innocence Project looked at the case, and when they realized that there was no DNA evidence involved, they passed the case to Wilmer Hale, a law agency. Fortunately, Ross E. Furstenbaum, a lawyer at Wilmer Hale, decided to take the case pro bono. Furstenbaum delved into the details, questioning a retired police lieutenant who had led the investigation. To his surprise, the lieutenant had maintained a file on the Emma Crasper case due to discomfort with its handling.
He asked me why I kept the case file, and I told him I figured someday someone would come knocking on my door. There were certain things in the case that made me have doubts whether Dewey Bozella was actually involved. Just could never throw it away.
This file contained witness accounts contradicting the testimony presented during his trial. The defense was never told about these statements, which raised big concerns about how fair the trial was. Moreover, the investigation brought to light compelling evidence pointing towards another individual. Lawyers at Wilmer Hale unearthed more suppressed evidence that showed Dewey's innocence, revealing that he'd been framed. They quickly took the case to court for a retrial. In court, the judge determined that the prosecution's case against Dewey relied heavily on the testimony of 2 individuals with criminal backgrounds. These witnesses, seeking leniency in their own cases, altered their accounts to favorably impact their legal situations. To make matters worse, prosecutors failed to disclose crucial evidence that could have potentially exonerated Dewey. This included testimony from a neighbor who attested to hearing noise near a window of the Emma apartment on the night of the murder. However, prosecutors argued that Mr. Dewey entered the building through the front door, not through the window, and the noises the neighbor heard were attributed to rustling garbage cans in the alleyway. However, the case took a different turn when a fingerprint belonging to a man named Donald Wise was found at that very window. Wise had previously been convicted of murdering another elderly woman in the same neighborhood and in a similar manner. Despite this, law enforcement had not pursued Wise as a suspect, and the prosecution failed to share this critical information with the defense. The failure to present this evidence was particularly damning as it contradicted the prosecution's story. The overlooked testimonies and evidence not only highlighted a lack of transparency in the legal proceedings, but also raised serious questions about the reliability of the case against Dewey Bozella. After all the evidence was presented, the Supreme Court Justice James Rooney of Putnam County, New York, had no option but to agree with the WilmerHale lawyers, highlighting the failure of Dutchess County District Attorney John King to disclose crucial evidence that would have exonerated Dewey. The judge declared, "The court is firmly and soundly convinced of the meritorious nature of the defendant's application." Eventually, in October 2009, the prosecution dismissed all charges against Dewey. On October 28, 2009, after serving 26 years in prison, Dewey Bozella was finally released.
It's our position that the matter must be dismissed in the interest of justice, and the people so move to dismiss the indictment.
Mr. Bozella is ordered to be released immediately.
Following his release from custody, Dewey Bozella embarked on a path of giving back to the community. In Newburgh, New York, he dedicated himself to mentoring youths at a local gym. While the gym unfortunately is now closed, Dewey's impact still remained evident in the lives of the teenagers he worked with. His focus extended beyond boxing as he imparted valuable lessons about the dangers of joining gangs, using his own experiences to guide and inspire the next generation. Dewey's commitment to community outreach went beyond the gym. He actively engaged with various organizations, delivering speeches that drew from the depth of his life experiences. His storytelling served as a powerful tool to connect with audiences as he shared insights gained from overcoming adversity and navigating a path to redemption. Dewey's involvement extended to the vibrant boxing scene in the New York City area, where he remained a familiar face at boxing events. His reputation as a mentor and his past achievements in the ring did not go unnoticed as he received an offer for a professional bout. In a remarkable turn of events, Dewey Bozella, while receiving an award in 2011, revealed his enduring dream of stepping into the professional boxing ring.
He started a foundation to teach the discipline of boxing to troubled youngsters, but what he wants most, to fight just one professional match.
It was a dream that seemed far-fetched at his age, but with the support of boxing champion Bernard Hopkins, that dream turned into reality. On October 15, 2011, at 52 years old, Dewey made his professional boxing debut on the undercard of the Bernard Hopkins versus Chad Dawson matchup at Staples Center in Los Angeles, California. Facing Larry Hopkins, he won in over 4 rounds and secured a unanimous decision victory.
For your winner by unanimous decision, Dewey Bozella.
Dewey had undergone rigorous training in Philadelphia under the guidance of Bernard Hopkins, which undoubtedly contributed to his remarkable achievement in the ring. The significance of Dewey's victory wasn't just in the fight itself, but in the inspiring journey it represented. Even President Barack Obama reached out to Dewey, offering words of encouragement and luck ahead of the historic fight. Notably, officials acknowledged Dewey as possibly the oldest licensed boxer ever to step into the ring in California, a testament to his resilience, determination, and the power of dreams realized against all odds. Following his exoneration, Dewey Bozella sued Dutchess County and its officials for wrongful imprisonment, seeking $25 million in restitution. Prior to a civil trial, the county settled the lawsuit in early January 2015, although the settlement amount wasn't initially disclosed. In February 2015, the county legislature voted to authorize a payment of $7.5 million to Dewey. However, the county did not admit any fault or liability on the part of its officials in the settlement. To cover the settlement, the county opted to issue bonds to be repaid over 5 years by county taxpayers. The $7.5 million settlement amount posed a substantial portion of the county's estimated 2015 budget of around $169 million. The wrongful incarceration lawsuit remained active until the money was officially transferred. As Dewey's legal team from WilmerHale took on the case pro bono, the entire $7.5 million settlement was awarded to him. Dewey Bozella's life has been a testament to resilience, marked by moments of triumph, hardship, and the despair he felt upon hearing the words life sentence, fearing the loss of the only life he had. Dewey presently lives in Fishkill, New York with his wife Trina. Dewey's journey has been recognized and celebrated on various platforms. In 2011, his inspiring story was showcased at ESPN's ESPY Award show, where he received the prestigious Arthur Ashe Courage Award. This acknowledgement honored his resilience in the face of adversity.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Good evening. The late, great, legendary boxing trainer Gusty Amato spoke about fear. He said, the hero and the coward both feel the same thing. But the hero uses this fear and projects it onto his opponent while the coward runs. This is the metaphor for all of us. Never let fear determine who you are. Never let where you come from determine where you are going. When I discovered this quote in the early days of my imprisonment, it truly inspired me. I memorized it. Every day I had to ask myself, how do I survive this nightmare in Sing Sing? A place where hate and anger are the order of the day. I didn't merely want to survive, I wanted to thrive. Boxing awakened me. I felt free during my workouts for the first time. I was no longer a prisoner. My vision became clear. I vowed to save children through teaching boxing and sharing my story. Hopefully, I can save others.
The years following his release from prison have been a testament to his indomitable spirit. At the Ring 10 Veterans Boxing Foundation's second annual fundraiser, Dewey credited boxing and the champions he encountered with saving his life. In 2016, Dewey wrote his memoir, Stand Tall, Fighting for My Life, Inside and Outside the Ring, chronicling his journey. He consistently credits boxing for instilling the discipline that became his anchor during the hardships of prison life. To this day, the police never found out who killed Emma Crasper. Dewey Bozella's story is a stark reminder that the justice system is not infallible. Wrongful convictions can occur due to various factors, including flawed evidence, witness testimonies, and procedural errors. It emphasizes the importance of continuous scrutiny and reform within the legal system. Do you think that the $7.5 million was enough compensation for 26 years of imprisonment? Do you think the officers involved should have been punished? Let us know what you think in the comments section. On May 8, 1981, 18-year-old college student Alice Sebold was assaulted in the middle of the night. However, Alice managed to brave through her ordeal and survive. In doing so, she not only helped capture her assailant, but also wrote a world-famous memoir called Lucky, which is based on her experience on it. In 2019, when a movie based on the popular memoir Lucky was under production, it had all the reasons to be a major success because it was under the direction of Karen McIntosh, who had recently given the world the hit show 13 Reasons Why, along with producer Timothy Mukanti. But the making was stopped because the producer had found something so shocking that the movie was stopped and a private investigator was hired. What was the detail that everyone else had missed? And what was the truth that the private detective was about to find out? Alice Sebold was born on September 6, 1963. She grew up in the Paoli suburb of Philadelphia, where her father taught Spanish at the University of Pennsylvania. Sebold and her older sister Mary often had to take care of their mother, a journalist for a local paper, who suffered from panic attacks and drank heavily. Despite her challenging childhood, Alice was talented with words and had big, beautiful dreams. Beaming with hope, Alice attended Syracuse University in New York at the age of 18. However, a dark event awaited her in New York that would shape the rest of her life. This tragedy would tie itself to all of her life's biggest moments for years to come. The biggest trauma, the biggest success, and the biggest regret. May 8th, 1981 was the last day of Alice's freshman year at Syracuse University, and at midnight, she was walking towards her dorm. She had crossed a pathway that passed a tunnel to an amphitheater near campus when she heard someone walking behind her. Fear gripped her and she started to walk faster. However, she was suddenly overtaken from behind and grabbed around the mouth. When she tried to run away, the man yanked her by the hair, dragging her along a brick path, pounding her skull into the ground, and said he'd kill her if she screamed. Eventually, she stopped resisting and tried to do what he wanted. Alice was forced to help the man in her own assault. She helped him undress herself. The man forced himself onto her. This is something you're used to hearing in true crime stories, but what happens next is more than unusual. When he was done, he told her that he wanted to hug her, but she was petrified and couldn't move. He pulled her back to the wall, hugged her, and apologized, saying, "I'm sorry, and you were a good girl." Then he asked her name. In her fear and confusion, she could only think of saying her real name, Alice. He replied, "It's nice knowing you, Alice, and I'll be seeing you around." Post the cruelty, the perpetrator had disappeared into the darkness where he came from. You'd probably wonder why you should watch this story if no murder happened. What mystery could there be after all? Well, by the end of this video, you will definitely be satisfied. After experiencing the worst moment of her life, Alice gathered all her strength to reach her dorm, all frail and bleeding. A student immediately called the ambulance upon seeing her injured. According to a medical exam, her nose was lacerated, her urine was bloody, and her clothes and hair were matted with dirt and leaves. When she was interviewed by the police the next morning, Alice told them that the perpetrator was a 16 to 18-year-old black man with a small and muscular build. In the affidavit, she wrote, "I desire prosecution in the event this individual is caught." But the perpetrator was far from getting caught because the detective found Alice's account not factual. He recommended that the case should be added to the inactive file. However, he didn't explain why he hadn't found Alice's account probable. On the other hand, Alice's life was completely morphed into a seemingly endless dark tunnel with no peace. Although she went back to her home in Philadelphia, she found herself as a misfit and was too lost to even change out of her nightgown. Her parents' friends from the church, where her mother was a warden, were told about the assaults and treated her as if she had contracted a spiritual disease. She sensed that her father believed she was somehow at fault for walking through a park alone at night. Her parents wanted her to drop out of Syracuse and spend her sophomore year at a small Catholic college near home. Her dreams were crashing down around her. But Alice decided she wouldn't give up on her dreams, and she returned to continue her studies in her passion of language and words. Weeks gave way to months, but there was no progress in the investigation of Alice's molestation. 5 months later, in October, Alice was still as affected as the first day of the assault. She gave her first assignment, where she turned in an opaque 5-page poem that alluded to the assault. "If they caught you," she wrote, "long enough for me to see that face again, maybe I would know your name." She went on, "Come to me, come to me, come die and lie beside me." And within a week, she did see him right in front of her across the main street of Marshall near campus, where she was picking up a snack for herself. The man in front of her appeared exactly the person who had altered her life forever and had been giving her nightmares. She quickly scurried out her checklist of right height, right build, etc., and it all checked. But that was not just it. A few minutes later, the same man crossed the street walking towards her. He said, "Hey, don't I know you from somewhere?" She was utterly mocked and humiliated and began to walk back to her campus hurriedly, but heard him laugh after her. She reached the campus distraught. Later, she sat with the police once again and sketched the man's face. The description was recognized, and 9 days later, a 20-year-old Anthony Broadwater was arrested. He was an ex-Marine Corps and now worked as a telephone installer. He maintained his innocence up until the very end of the trial. He told the police that he didn't remember what he did that night 5 months ago, but he knew that he was not assaulting Alice or any girl. However, the evidence was stacked against him. After Alice's assault, while she was being examined, a negroid pubic hair was found on her genitalia. It was revealed to be Anthony's. He was taken into custody and charged with 8 felony counts, including rape and sodomy. When the case went to court, Alice bravely showed up and gave harrowing details. Immediately after the closing statement, the judge pronounced Anthony guilty. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Just like that, he was gone from the picture until the year 1999, when Alice brought him back to the news by writing a memoir, Lucky. The memoir was about the assault on May 8, 1981 that she'd survived. It provided a very detailed insight on how an assault victim saw the world on a daily basis. While most people try to hide their sexual trauma, Alice had given unflinching details that could make the reader feel something crawling under their skin. It was an unashamed and honest account of the horror that had shaped Alice's life, something other victims could look up to. The memoir sold over 1 million copies, and it also launched Alice's writing career as an author. Yet, this was only the beginning. Her true breakthrough came in 2002 with her second book, The Lovely Bones. When it hit the shelves, it captivated readers worldwide, selling 10 million copies. This breakthrough drew a comparison between the success of her debut novel and another hugely commercialized debut of Gone with the Wind. The stigma associated with Alice ultimately helped her become the writer she had always dreamed of being. But it was not the happy ending it had appeared to be. In fact, it would bring Alice the biggest regret of her life. But before hitting the low, there was a greater high yet to come. In 2009, Alice's books were still seeing hype. The Lovely Bones was turned into a movie, casting actors like Stanley Tucci and Saoirse Ronan. Exactly 10 years down the lane, her memoir Lucky was also ready to be a film adaptation. The movie was to be named Lucky and directed by Karen Marie Moncriefa, along with producer Timothy Muccianti. He was deeply distressed by the attack Alice had gone through. As an executive producer, he wished to do as much justice to the case and to the movie as possible. He'd immersed himself in the memoir Lucky and would spend hours outlining how the movie would showcase the contents of the book. Nights had passed by with him still immersed in the book. The first half had left him utterly shocked and distressed by the minute details of the attack. However, as he began the second half of the book, his feelings began to shift drastically. He held a critical eye because now it was going to be under his production, and he was spotting something he'd missed earlier. The information wasn't adding up and seemed factually incorrect to him. He found himself obsessed with the inaccuracies in the account of how Anthony Broadwater was identified, prosecuted, and sentenced. The more he'd read, the less accurate or justified it appeared. These were some of the discrepancies that gave Timothy sleepless nights. Alice mentioned in her memoir that before the day she had identified Anthony at Marshall Road, she identified several people to be her assaulter many times in her head, but she convinced herself they were not her tormentor. Later, Alice identified Anthony, claiming she saw him mocking her on the road. However, Anthony told investigators that he wasn't talking to Alice at all. In fact, standing behind her was a police officer named Paul Clapper, a former rookie cop who used to patrol Anthony's neighborhood, and it was him Anthony was addressing. Despite police officers confirming this information, the scenario was dismissed as irrelevant during the investigation. After the sketch, the police had a lineup of 5 people for Alice to identify the perpetrator. Anthony stood at the 4th position, yet Alice identified the 5th one. However, this error in identification was also dismissed because Anthony was accused of bringing a friend that looked like him to dupe and confuse Alice. In the court as well, 31-year-old Assistant District Attorney Gail Ubelhor wrote in a memo that Alice had chosen the wrong man because he was a dead ringer for the defendant. Although Anthony maintained his innocence throughout, he had no one to back him up. During his trial, not one of his family or friends showed up for him, and his own was the only testimony he had. In early 2021, the actors for the movie were set to fly to Toronto to begin shooting. Victoria Pedretti was cast as Alice, and Marcia Gay Harden as her mother. The movie's financier, Timothy Mucciante, had a complicated past. He was a disbarred attorney who had spent about a decade in prison for bank fraud and forgery of bonds, but he'd been transparent about his history. Despite this, the funds to start shooting never materialized. When the production team received a copy of a wire transfer from Mucciante that seemed to have been doctored, the font of the dollar signs didn't match. They terminated his involvement in the project, and the shooting was called off. His work on the production of Lucky began to falter because he wasn't convinced Anthony Broadwater was the perpetrator of Alice Sebold's assault, and so he was fired from the production. Yet for Timothy, it was not about just the business anymore. It was not only about justice for Alice, but also about the possible injustice done to Anthony Broadwater. Determined to uncover the truth, Timothy had hired a private investigator, Dan Myers, to delve into the details of Alice's case and the guilt of Anthony Broadwater. All this time, Anthony had tried 5 times to fight his conviction and fight for his innocence in the court, arguing that Alice had a reduced ability to perceive objects accurately due to the fear she felt during and after the attack. He also argued that Alice had probably added the person she saw on the street in Syracuse that day into the mental file of her perpetrator, but this appeal was denied. At the time of the case, Anthony had left the Marine Corps to take care of his father, a former janitor at Syracuse who was dying of cancer. His mother had died of pneumonia when he was 5, and he and his 5 brothers had been dispersed among various relatives. After the conviction, he spent the first few months of his sentence at Great Meadow Correctional Facility. Many of the men there had just been sentenced, and the atmosphere was thick with hatred, frustration, pain, and disbelief. Eventually, he was moved to Auburn Prison. As a convicted offender, he'd become a target for other prisoners. During one such altercation, a close friend from Syracuse was killed in the kitchen while Anthony stood nearby, desperately shielding himself with a baking tray. Each time he was transferred to a new prison, he had devised a strategy to survive. He would try to prevent some incident by asking the gang leaders to read the pages from his appeal and transcripts from his trial, hoping it would buy him some safety. That was one way to save his life. In Attica Prison, an inmate read parts of his transcript aloud to the cell block. Fearing the worst, Anthony prepared a weapon by placing tuna fish cans inside 2 socks. But after the inmate finished reading, several men approached him, expressing sympathy and disbelief. "You shouldn't be in prison, man," they told him and offered sympathy. All these years, Anthony was fighting his conviction while unaware of this development. Alice was busy having her books made into movies, writing, helping assaulted victims around the world find their voice, and giving interviews to hosts like Oprah Winfrey. Every time Anthony would be transferred to another prison, he felt a little hope that he was going home. But over the years, when it didn't happen for him, he learned that he was going to have to serve his sentence because no judge would take up his case. He understood that unless he took blame for the rape, the parole board wouldn't release him. He'd spent 16 years, and there were 9 more to go to reach his maximum sentence. He'd reached his conditional release date, which was determined by a committee that considered a person's record in prison. Based on that, he was released in 1999. Just like that, free to go. But the story was far from being over. He moved in with his cousins, picking up his life again that was all around him like breadcrumbs. At the age of 38, he'd finally gotten his freedom, but meanwhile, his father had died and his brothers hadn't kept in touch. He applied for temp jobs, but as a registered offender with a 16-year gap in his work history, he was rejected. He had bought a $19 shovel from a hardware store and began clearing people's driveways after snowstorms. When winter ended, he mowed their lawns. A year after his release, his cousins set him up with Elizabeth, a roofer. On their first night, he insisted she read his trial documents before they pursued a relationship. He slept on the couch while she spent the night with the transcripts. In the morning, she tearfully told him she believed in his innocence. They found jobs together, roofing, janitorial, and factory work, requesting night shifts to ensure alibis during the witching hours when most crimes occur. Despite his status as a sex offender, Elizabeth never left him or doubted him. However, they chose not to have children to spare any potential stigma. In 2001, 2 years into his freedom, police knocked on his door regarding the murder of an 18-year-old woman in Syracuse. Terrified, Anthony explained he had a solid alibi, working nights. Though the police didn't pursue him as a suspect, the experience made him so fearful that he avoided jobs with female employees, worried any gesture might be misinterpreted. He became preoccupied with the mechanics of surveillance. He wanted jobs where he could punch into a clock, his movements recorded by cameras in each room. The idea of just being loose in the world without a method of proving where he'd been was such a source of terror that sometimes he imagined he'd feel less anxiety if he was back in a jail cell. Anthony was completely unaware there's a private detective hired purely for him and how far involved he was into the story of Anthony's innocence. The private investigator, Dan Myers, had already contacted Paul Clapper, the cop Anthony talked to at the Marshall Road. Clapper believed in Anthony's innocence and was desperate to pass this information for years. One day, Dan Myers had rung the doorbell of Anthony with a proposition that could wash away years of blemish on Anthony's reputation as a person. Myers shared what he'd learned with two Syracuse lawyers, Dave Hammond and Melissa Swartz, saying he believed that Broadwater was innocent. They both read Lucky, and ironically, it was the strongest proof of Anthony's innocence. Timothy raised money for Hammond and Swartz to work on Broadwater's case. He also hired Red Hawk Films, a small production company, to make a documentary about Broadwater's quest to prove his innocence. Years after his release, Anthony finally sued the court, accusing it for his wrongful conviction. The entire case against Anthony hung on the microscopic hair analysis, but in later years, the methodology had been discredited. In 2015, in one of the country's worst forensic scandals, the Justice Department and the FBI acknowledged that, for 2 decades, forensic examiners had been applying erroneous standards to the comparison of hairs. Moreover, studies had shown that about 1/3 of eyewitness identifications were wrong. When the defendant and witness were of different races, the witness was 50% more likely to make a mistake. Finally, after years of torment and anguish, in August 2021, Anthony was exonerated.
This court grants defendant's motion to look objectively at the facts, to look a little deeper into what actually happened. You quickly come to the conclusion that this was wrong.
Anthony's exoneration instantly restored his dignity, but completely stripped 58-year-old Alice of hers.
Anything to say to Anthony Broadwater?
The face she'd populated her mind with was not her accused assailant. The personal loss and the guilt of having an innocent man convicted had quickly caught up to her. Moreover, she was a public figure now. As soon as the news broke, she was criticized harshly, trolled online, and called out for being a fake who made it all up for her books. Initially, it appeared she was laying low, but within a couple of days, she had released a public apology to Anthony. Although Alice's apology didn't do anything to mitigate the hate against her online, Anthony had teared up and said it must have taken a lot of bravery for her to accept a mistake of this kind, and that he wished to meet her face to face. After winning the case against the court's injustice and wrongful sentence, Broadwater received a $5.5 million settlement from the state of New York, which he planned to use to buy land in a brick house with his wife, Elizabeth, fulfilling a childhood dream of having a farm. He also has a pending federal civil rights lawsuit against the city of Syracuse and officials involved in his prosecution. Also, Alice's publisher, Scribner, announced they'd paused distribution of her memoir, Lucky, which recounted the assault, while working with her to consider revisions. The trial of Alice was wrong on so many levels. Alice was never given the justice for what she suffered. An injustice took place with Anthony Broadwater, and a man who didn't beat a woman roamed the world freely all of his life. For all we know, he's still out there somewhere. The case drew criticism for its racial dynamics and the flawed legal system that led to Broadwater's wrongful imprisonment. Do you think injustice like this is prevalent in the system, or was this a case of its own kind? Let us know in the comment section below.
Verdict Form B. We, the jury, find the defendant Daniel Villegas not guilty of...
I was 17. All I wanted to do was just leave that room and go home.
I'm like, my God, how did they convict this kid?
You were hooked.
I was hooked.
On Saturday night, April 9th, 1993, the community of El Paso, Texas, had just celebrated Good Friday. Amongst them were 4 teenage boys: Robert England, 18, Armando Lazo, 17, Jesse Hernandez, 16, and Juan Medina, 18, who were partying hard to kick off the weekend. When the clock hit 12 a.m., the boys decided to head back home. As they were walking, a car pulled over and began shooting at them. When the investigation proceeded and the police caught the perpetrator, the city was in uproar. What happens next would be nothing short of a roller coaster ride. The northeastern side of El Paso, Texas, where the 4 teenage boys were out partying, was notorious for illegal gang activities and drug smuggling among young boys. It was considered to be one of the most dangerous places in the city. The 4 teenage boys, however, were partying hard, enjoying their short-lived weekend before going back to attend classes on Monday once again. Little did they know that this would be their last weekend together. As they were walking back to their homes together after midnight and were crossing the intersection, a car sped past them but continued to stop at odd intervals while driving down the street.
We walked heading east, but when we got to Kellogg Street, a car pulled up. And first instincts was, hey, my cousins picked us up. But Mondo and Bobby, they saw the car first because they were in front of me. And when this car pulls up, they start yelling at the car. And then I look at the car and I say, that's not my cousin's car.
It was pitch dark outside, and the only thing that was glowing from time to time were the car's headlights. The boys couldn't see who was inside the vehicle because the windows were very darkly tinted.
Car just coming through here and going all the way out this way, and then went down this way and parked right there. By the time we got about here, the car was already there, and we approached it. I was thinking like, hey, that's Hector.
Jesse questioned his friends as to why the car decided to stop at that very spot, a few meters away from them. There was no stop sign anywhere near them either. The car finally sped off and the boys let out a sigh of relief. Jesse told the boys it was a close one and that they should leave for their respective houses at once. However, they wouldn't get the chance. Jesse saw the car drive back to the intersection, stop suddenly, and turn off their headlights. He knew something was about to happen. Seconds later, the passenger seat's window rolled down and someone started shouting in Spanish before a gun was pointed right at them and multiple shots were fired. Jesse Hernandez and Juan Medina ran as fast as they could away from the gunshots, hoping that their friends were following them close behind. Unfortunately, Robert England was shot right in the head once, and he bled out and died in the middle of the street. Armando Lazo was shot twice, once in his abdomen and once in his thigh. He, however, continued to run from the shooters for about 100 yards before collapsing on the lawn of a nearby house. The residents immediately called 911. The police were informed that 5 or 6 gunshots were heard being fired and that a 17-year-old boy was lying dead in front of their house. The police and paramedics rushed to the scene, and the investigation into the double homicide began. When the police arrived at the scene, they retrieved 6 casings from a .22 caliber handgun on the street. After a few blocks, Jesse and Juan decided to head back to see what happened to their friends. When they arrived at the scene, the police were already there, thoroughly investigating the case. When the police met Jesse and Juan, they began questioning them. Both of the boys told investigators that they didn't know who the shooter was and couldn't give a detailed description of the cars since it was pitch black when the incident occurred. They told the investigators that they believed the vehicle in question was a red or maroon SUV. This case received extensive media coverage since a shooting resulting in double murder in the middle of the streets was not common in the El Paso area in 1993. Newspapers and local TV stations covered the whole case from the very beginning, also warning the community about the gang activity which was at its peak and the worst El Paso had seen in over 30 years. The detective who was given the responsibility to solve this double homicide was Alfonso Marquez, a successful and tough investigator who had a reputation of making killers confess to their crime. On April 13, 1993, the police station received an anonymous tip that led Detective Marquez to their first suspect, a 15-year-old kid named Michael Johnson. Michael was brought into the interrogation room and handcuffed for 8 hours while he was extensively questioned. Detective Marquez told Michael that he already knew that Michael was responsible for the shooting that killed the 2 boys 3 days earlier because of a tip received from one of Michael's friends. He was threatened with the death penalty. The detective also threatened Michael by saying that he'd make sure that Michael got used when he'll be sent to jail if he didn't confess to the crime. Michael, out of fear, confessed to the shooting of the 2 boys. However, Detective Marquez, realizing that the statement given by Michael was inconsistent with the facts of the crime, concluded the statement given by Michael was false and he wasn't charged. A few days later, a 17-year-old boy named David Rangel, who lived in El Paso, called his cousin, Daniel Villegas, to discuss their plans for the weekend. During their conversation, Daniel told David that he was the one responsible for the double homicide and that he'd killed the 2 boys with a shotgun. David, thinking it was a prank, didn't take Daniel's words seriously. On April 21st, 1993, 11 days after the shooting, Detective Marquez received a tip about a boy named David Rangel who might have information about the shooting and decided to meet with him. He asked David to come to the station with him. His mother was informed that David just needed to sign some paperwork at the station and that there was nothing serious going on. David thought he was going to be interrogated for a little fight he had with other teens in his neighborhood. However, when Detective Marquez started asking him about the shooting that took place on April 10th, David froze. The detective continued to threaten David, telling him to confess to the shooting or else he'd be sent to jail and raped by other inmates. Frightened out of his wits, David confessed that it wasn't him but his cousin, Daniel Villegas, who had committed the crime and even confessed to it over a phone call. Detective Marquez immediately rushed to arrest Daniel. When the police arrived at the Villegas household, they informed the family that they had a warrant for Daniel Villegas' arrest. 16-year-old Daniel was immediately handcuffed and dragged to the police car. His mother told him not to say anything and that she'd get a lawyer. Texas law did allow a detective to question a minor without the presence of a lawyer or a legal guardian. On April 22nd, Daniel's parents rushed to the El Paso police headquarters, hoping to bring their son back home. However, unfortunately for them, Daniel had given the detectives a full signed confession and was now charged with murder. In the carefully typed confession, Daniel told the detective that he and 4 of his friends were driving down the street in a white car that belonged to one of his friends. They saw the 4 boys, Robert England, Armando Lazo, Jesse Hernandez, and Juan Medina, walking down the street together and shouted at them before driving away. But Daniel decided to make a U-turn and drive back to where the boys were. He then pulled out his shotgun and started firing at the boys from the rear passenger seat. One of the bullets that hit Robert England instantly killed him. Then Daniel, realizing Armando Lazo was only severely injured, chased him down the road to finish him off. A few hours later, when Daniel was allowed to meet his mom, Yolanda Villegas, he told her that he didn't commit the crime. He narrated how Detective Marquez terrified him by telling him that if he didn't confess to the murder, he'd be sent to jail where he'd be raped and later would receive the death sentence and would be sent to the electric chair or hanged. He told her how they kept him in the interrogation the whole night, typing and deleting multiple confessions until they'd written the perfect one. Charged with double homicide at the age of 16, Daniel Villegas' trial began. The trial began in December of 1994. Daniel's attorney brought 18 witnesses to testify. They told the court that Daniel could never have done such a thing because he was with his family the whole night. However, many statements were ruled out since some facts didn't seem to be in place and were contradictory with statements given from other witnesses. When the trial came to a close, 11 jurors thought that Daniel was guilty of capital murder. However, one jury didn't budge and strongly believed that Daniel was not guilty. Thus, the trial was ruled a mistrial. In 1995, Daniel was tried for a second time. His parents had scraped together every penny they had to hire the best attorney during his first trial and were still paying off the attorney's fees. Consequently, they were unable to hire a reputed attorney for the second trial. His new attorney brought only one witness and argued that the prosecution didn't have any evidence that Daniel was the one who committed this murder. Unfortunately for Daniel, Texas law allowed the court to render a guilty verdict based merely on a confession, and Daniel gave his confession clearly to Detective Marquez. On August 24, 1995, Daniel Villegas was found guilty of capital murder and was given 2 life terms.
Final rejection.
I fell apart.
So they were telling you just forget it, no hope.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
His cousin, David, plunged into depression, blaming himself for the fate that now awaited Daniel. No family members were allowed to speak to him, as he was immediately taken from the courtroom to jail.
I've been beat down by the law so much, going appeals failing, appeals after appeals failing, no one listening to you. I was going to be in the grave back in Huntsville with a TDC number on my gravesite.
In 2005, a woman named Lucy was working as a teller in a local bank when a regular named John Membella visited. The pair were quite smitten during their first encounter, which led to more encounters, which eventually led to their marriage. Lucy had been married once before and had 3 daughters from that marriage. One day, Lucy told her husband about her former husband's brother, Daniel Villegas, who was in prison due to what she believed was a false confession. John was intrigued by the case immediately and decided that he was going to be the one to prove Daniel's innocence. He spent hours going through all the documents related to the case and realized all the faults present in the case, including Daniel's alibi. About 2 to 3 months later, John knew he couldn't rest. He needed to visit Daniel in prison. When the two met, Daniel told him everything truthfully, how he was interrogated in a small room with just him and Detective Marquez, and how the detective was aggressively trying to get Daniel to falsely confess, even though Daniel told him repeatedly that he did not do it. After hearing in detail what had occurred when the confession was given, John finally understood how someone could be forced into making a false confession. He promised Daniel that he'd get him out of prison, thus giving Daniel hope for a life he never got to live. John decided to hire private investigators to look into the case properly, and after thorough study, they were able to locate a witness, Jesse Hernandez. John and his private detective paid a visit to the man who was present and narrowly escaped death during the shooting that took place back on April 10th, 1993. John asked Jesse if he was willing to talk about what had happened on the night of the shooting, and Jesse, though visibly upset about revisiting those haunting memories, agreed to narrate everything to them. The detective asked Jesse if he believed Daniel to be the shooter. Jesse replied that all he knew was that Daniel was found guilty for killing his 2 friends. John told Jesse of how Daniel was convicted despite the fact that they never found the vehicle he and his friends were riding in that night, nor the gun with which he had supposedly shot Robert England and Armando Lazo. No fingerprints were retrieved from the crime scene either. Basically, no physical evidence was present against Daniel, and he was convicted solely on his confession. The private investigator then pulled out a copy of Daniel's confession and handed it to Jesse. After reading the confession, Jesse told the 2 men that everything in this confession is wrong.
He left me with some nightmares. I'm a grown man, but I can see how Daniel was forced into a confession.
He pointed out that he clearly remembered the car to be a large red or maroon SUV and not a small white car as Daniel described. Moreover, the vehicle on the night of the shooting was heading westbound, but according to Daniel, he and his friends were traveling eastbound. He also added how the gunshot shells retrieved from the crime scene were that of a .22 caliber pistol, not a shotgun as Daniel claimed. There was also one more major flaw in Daniel's confession. Daniel told the detective that he'd fired 2 to 3 shots and later got out of the vehicle and followed the guys to finish them off. But in reality, 6 shots were fired continuously, all of the shell casings of which were found in one specific place at the crime scene. This meant that the shooter had not followed the boys, but instead fired all shots from the same location. Shocked, Jesse asked John how Daniel was convicted when his confession didn't match the facts of the case. Upon asking who the detective was and learning that it was Alfonso Marquez, Jesse's body went cold. He told John that it was this very man who arrived at the crime scene that night and accused him of murdering his 2 best friends. Jesse was taken to the police station for interrogation, where he was repeatedly threatened into confessing to the shooting. Jesse maintained his innocence, saying that he would never kill his own friends, but Detective Marquez kept repeating, "I know you did it." Jesse was also close to confessing, just like Daniel, but he was saved by his own mother, who arrived at the station and declared that she would sue the detective and the whole police department if they didn't let her son go. John, realizing that he had enough evidence to give Daniel one more chance, decided to hire the best attorney he could find. In 2018, over 2 decades after the shooting, a third trial for the double homicide case began.
25 years after the first trial, we were covering this gavel to gavel at the Law and Crime Network. Villegas spent 18 years in prison.
Jesse Hernandez promised John that he'd take his stand in the court and give his account of the whole incident in order to prove Daniel's innocence.
It turns into the street and it stops. And at that moment, we thought we were going to have a confrontation. We thought that they were going to get out of the car and confront us, but that never happened. It decides to leave, but it doesn't leave more than a couple of feet, and then it stops.
Is it fair to say then, Mr. Hernandez, that you don't know who's in that car or who that car belongs to?
No.
All right. Do you remember saying that it was both Bobby and Mondo that approached the car?
Yes.
Okay, so they're together approaching the car. Where are you? Do you approach the car?
No.
Where are you?
I stood as close to because the fence, because that's where Mondo had his shirt.
Okay. And where is Juan? Juan
He's right beside me.
So he's with you, and it's Mondo and Bobby together.
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
Yes, ma'am.
And they approach the car, and at that point, you think the shots are fired at that point?
Yeah, as soon as he says your mama, he takes a couple of steps towards the vehicle, the shots were fired.
Okay.
I see like a glow.
Juan Medina also took the stand to talk about his traumatizing experience of the night, providing additional information as to what happened on the night of the shooting, which was contradictory to the confession given by Daniel.
And after you started running, did the gunshots continue? Did they stop?
They did. They continued. But as we got further away, I mean, with the adrenaline going and everything, I just lost track. I couldn't hear him anymore.
David Rangel, Daniel's cousin, took the stand to give his testimony.
Back in April of 1993, did you tell the El Paso Police Department that the defendant told you that he committed the shooting?
Yes.
Okay.
He told me, guess who did it? And I don't know. And then he said, well, guess. And I'm like, I have no idea. And so we kind of went back and forth a few times, and then he says, I did.
David explained how he knew the whole time that Daniel was not capable of doing such a thing, but he felt he had no choice but to give the detectives a name due to constant pressure and threats. He also talked about his guilt for partly being the reason for Daniel's almost 20 years of imprisonment. After the final arguments from both the prosecution and the defense, the jury came to a verdict.
Judicial District, the State of Texas versus Daniel Villegas, number 94 0D09328. Verdict Form B. We, the jury, find the defendant Daniel Villegas not guilty of...
Daniel Villegas was finally a free man.
Daniel Villegas spent more than 20 years in jail after he was wrongfully convicted of capital murder in the fatal shootings of Robert England and Armando Lasso. And at UTEP, he gave an emotional account of what it has been like for him just a few years after he won his freedom. Villegas says he found himself waking up at night and knocking on walls to ensure he wasn't dreaming. He would check to see if he really was free and not in prison. And it is hard to trust others after spending so much time in jail for a crime he did not commit, he said.
He was a young man that needed help, and I thank God that he put me in the situation to help.
And I always think to myself, is these going to be the last days I have with him? They're going to be... I'm going to wake up in October and on the 9th, and then I'm going to be in a jail cell waiting to get shipped out to prison.
After almost 2 decades of prison time, Daniel, who is almost in his late 30s now, talked about how hard it was for him to adjust to his newly granted freedom. However, his family were always by his side, making the process much easier. He also appeared on many television shows to talk about his experience in being caught up in a case of wrongful conviction. Daniel has had many campaigns since his release to bring awareness about false confessions and wrongful convictions, as well as voicing one's opinions and thoughts if they feel wronged by anyone, even the justice system. Now we ask you, why do you think this shooting occurred in the first place? Do you think the real killer will ever be caught? What are your opinions on the aggressive interrogation tactics employed by Detective Alfonso Marquez?
That Cleveland police officer on trial for killing 2 unarmed people, Michael Brelo, charged with voluntary manslaughter after a high-speed chase ended in a spray of gunfire.
The officers collectively fired 137 shots during that chase. 2 people who were unarmed were killed in a hail of bullets.
On November 29, 2012, a 23-mile car chase involving 2 African-American individuals, Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams, ended in tragedy when officers shot at them under mistaken circumstances. There was an intense 23-mile police chase with over 60 officers chasing the couple. The car got surrounded by 13 officers shooting at them, and then someone fired the final shot. The most shocking part of the incident were the actions of Cleveland police officer Michael Brelo, who continued firing even after the vehicle stopped moving. But what seemed like an open and shut case eventually resulted in a huge outrage by the public when the verdict was announced. What followed left a hole in the hearts of Timothy and Melissa's loved ones as they craved for justice.
You heard an officer make a comment, it's cowboy and Indians now. Why would you say that if you don't have malice or intent in your heart to do harm? They knew that night that once they caught up to Tim and Melissa that they were going to let them have it, and that's exactly what happened.
43-year-old Timothy Russell was living at the Metropolitan Ministry, a homeless shelter, but 2 days before his death, he was placed in transitional housing. He met 30-year-old Melissa Williams at the Bishop Cosgrove Center, where they both received free meals. Melissa Williams lived at the Norma Hare's Women's Center on Payne Avenue. Melissa Williams struggled with drug addiction and had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Her closest relatives were her mother, Martha Williams, and her sister, Tiani Williams. Tiani Williams was serving life in prison for killing her boyfriend after an argument. She burned his apartment down while he was passed out. She also suffered from drug addiction and mental retardation. She'd been abused both as a child and an adult. Looking at Tiani Williams' life gives a brief look into the struggles of her sister, Melissa.
New video just released shows the woman at the center of a deadly police shooting in the back of a cruiser. Melissa Williams was killed after police opened fire a week ago today on the car she was in. This video shows Williams after she was arrested several weeks ago. She is handcuffed and agitated, threatening officers.
Records show that the Cleveland police had dealt with Melissa Williams 33 times since 2001, mostly due to drug and mental health issues. As for Timothy Russell, his next of kin was his father, David Russell, and his siblings, David Jr., Michael, Michelle, and Donald. He also had a teenage son. Russell had also been in trouble with the law for different reasons. These included criminal trespassing, domestic violence, endangering children, receiving stolen property, petty theft, aggravated robbery, fleeing and eluding, and failure to comply with the police. On November 29, 2012, Timothy Russell was driving a 1979 light blue Chevrolet Malibu while Melissa Williams sat in the passenger seat. As they were driving around, a plainclothed police officer spotted their car. This was in an area known for drug deals, which made the officer suspicious. Russell and Williams met where they received free meals, but were linked by their drug use. Witnesses revealed that they had met on the evening of the shooting to obtain drugs. They'd also used cocaine right before the high-speed pursuit that unfortunately ended their lives. However, their illegal activities were no excuse for what happened to them that evening.
Let me tell you something. Yeah. For real. Judges, police officers, even the newscast may do drugs. Everybody do something, but that's not a right for you to kill him like that. Do you see what he did? Why is he off? You got on top of the car. Who does that?
When the officer ran the license plate, there was nothing worth noting. Still, the car made a turn signal violation, so it was pulled over. Russell immediately pulled over and complied with the police. The car wasn't searched and they were allowed to go. Suddenly, as Russell drove past two officers, they heard what they believed to be shots being fired. Later on, it was revealed that this sound was actually their car backfiring. This was the sound that triggered a high-speed chase that ended up in a tragedy. At around 10:31 p.m., Cleveland policeman Michael Brelo was driving north on West 25th Street. Then he heard a transmission saying, "Old Chevy just popped around as he passed by a mobile support. Justice Center, westbound on Superior, Old Chevy." He quickly switched on his lights and sirens to respond to the call. He also heard two black males, shots fired, popped around right as he drove by us. At Detroit Avenue, Brelo turned onto the bridge and saw other police cars in front of him driving downtown. He saw the blue 1979 Malibu on the bridge racing the other way. He also caught a glimpse of the driver. Other police cars followed. A passenger officer radioed, "A Chevy just blew by us, going over the Detroit Superior Bridge." Brelo followed the chase. The Malibu went west on Detroit Avenue, and despite the police cars trying to block its path, it turned onto West 45th Street. Many other squad cars joined the chase, going west on Lorraine Avenue and then back east on Clark Avenue towards Tremont. The officer in the lead car said, "Passenger is, very angry." Once they got to Clark Avenue, there were so many cars that Brelo was the fifth or sixth car in line. Then the lead officer radioed, "Heading towards Steelyard. He's pointing the gun at the back window. Heads up, everybody be careful." Afterward, the police cars followed the Malibu past Steelyard Commons, through Tremont on West 14th Street, and then onto Interstate 90. When they arrived downtown, it let out another bang, which was probably a backfire or a blown tire, but it placed the officers on alert. The car hit 100 miles per hour, and the police cars sped up too, intensifying the chase. As the Malibu reached St. Clair Avenue, a vice officer radioed, "He does not have a gun. He has a pair of black gloves on. He does not have a gun in his hand." But 2 minutes later, another voice, a supervisor, said, "Passenger is reaching for something underneath the glove box area. They're fumbling with something up in that front seat. Looks like the passenger got, possibly loading a weapon." 20 minutes into the chase, Russell and Williams drove into the Heritage Middle School parking lot. About 60 police cars followed up the driveway. This was around 10:55 p.m. Then Brelo heard an officer say, "Block off the back. Shots fired. Shots fired."
Looked like he was loading a weapon. Shots fired!
Officers maintained that they believed that there was a firearm in the car. So when one of the officers opened fire, others followed, hitting both occupants. Using his ambush training, Brelo drew his Glock 17 pistol and fired through his patrol car's windshield. His partner also opened fire. Brelo then loaded a new magazine, thinking that his gun jammed, and jumped out of the car. He ran left, seeking cover from the other patrol cars, firing more shots at the suspects with the other officers. He reloaded his gun's magazine again, which carried 17 rounds. Other officers were firing at the car standing still. Brelo had jumped onto the hood of the car and fired 15 shots through the windshield while the car had already stopped moving. He later claimed that he could not recall shooting the suspects from the hood of the car. Under the daze of the lights and police sirens, he started to hear, "Cease fire! Cease fire!" By the time they opened the car, both occupants had passed away.
I've never been so afraid in my life. I thought my partner and I would be shot and that we were going to be killed. And I just couldn't understand why the suspects were moving, still shooting at us.
The investigation into this ghastly shooting started immediately after it ended. Investigators spent the entire night photographing and searching the scene, and that's when they found something shocking. 139 bullets had been shot in total. The bullet fragments were so many that they started writing the numbers on the evidence tags to keep up. The next morning, the bodies in the car were examined. It turned out that Russell was shot 23 times, while Williams was shot 24 times. After the medical examiners checked the car, there was an awful realization. There was no gun in the car. Then the Malibu was transported to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Even after 3 days of searching and photographing the car, they didn't find the gun. Police searched the driveway, parking lot, grass, and everywhere along the 20-mile chase route. But there was still no gun to be found.
What were you hearing on the radio?
We heard that the suspect was pointing a gun out the window. We heard the person that was calling out the chase said, I remember him saying, "Be careful. He's pointing a gun."
The two occupants were unarmed, which meant that the car chase shouldn't have happened in the first place, and because of that, 2 innocent people lost their lives. The car was found with 92 bullet holes and 58 in the windshield. There were also bullets and bullet fragments in the car, but no bullet cartridges. The only thing in the car were an empty red Coca-Cola can, 2 lighters, and a crack pipe. Investigators interviewed the 13 officers who fired their guns. First, they interviewed Moore, Brelo's partner, who had fired 19 rounds. This is the second most after Brelo's 49. She said, "The shots were going off forever, and it felt like I was being shot at." 2 other officers, Sabalik and Farley, pulled up as the gunfire started. Sabalik said, "Then I stopped firing because I saw somebody jump on the hood of the car, a police officer." Then the investigator asked, "Later on, you found out what was up on the hood of the car? How did you find that out?" Sabalik replied, "Because he was talking about it." When asked who he was referring to, he replied, "Mike Brelo." During the interview, Brelo broke down crying while recounting the shooting. He claimed he did not remember being on the hood of the Malibu. The only thing he said was that this might have been due to his Marine training. When asked if he feared for his life and that of the other officers, he said, "The most I've ever been in my life, sir, even with Iraq. I thought we were going to be rammed, and I thought we were going to get shot and be killed." After the investigation, Michael Brelo was charged with 2 counts of voluntary manslaughter in connection with the shooting. That was because he was the only officer to continue shooting even after the others stopped firing. The main question was, were his final 15 bullets what dealt the fatal blow to Russell and Williams? 28-year-old Michael Brelo was a member of the Cleveland Police Department, which he joined in 2007. Brelo came from a family of police officers and veterans. His late grandfather, John J. Quinn, was a World War II veteran and had 38 years of experience as a Cleveland patrolman and vice detective. Quinn's wife passed away, and he raised 5 kids, including Brelo's mother. Mike Quinn, Brelo's uncle and godfather, was also sergeant in Cleveland's homicide unit. He said, "It was really his dream to get onto the police department. In police families, that's really common. You want to follow in the footsteps." Brelo was a high school junior when Al-Qaeda attacked the U.S. on September 11, 2001. This and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq encouraged him to join the Marine Corps. He enlisted in 2003. Despite his young age, Brelo already had 5 years of experience as a Cleveland police officer. He was praised by police supervisors for his dedication and willingness to confront danger. In the first 9 months of 2012, he had the most arrests in the evening platoon of the 2nd District, with 61 felony arrests and 125 misdemeanors. On February 24, 2011, a few months before the shooting, Brelo and his frequent partner Liz Galarza received a Medal of Heroism from the police department for the arrest of a domestic violence suspect. By October 2012, he was recommended for a Community Award for outstanding job performance and dedication. He received the award 2 weeks before the chase on November 29th. Before November 29th, Brelo faced an accusation of excessive force. This was in March 2010 when Brelo and 2 other officers arrested 34-year-old Donald Pate for armed robbery. He claimed that Brelo hit him on the head with a flashlight while he was surrendering. However, this did not hold up in court.
This trial comes more than 2 years after the deadly police chase and shooting of 2 unarmed suspects. Cleveland police officer Michael Brelo goes on trial this morning for voluntary manslaughter charges for his role in the deaths of Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams after a 20-minute police chase back on November 29, 2012. Prosecutors say Brelo stood on the hood of the suspect's car and fired 49 shots, some of which were fatal. The 31-year-old Brelo waived his right to a jury trial, and instead it will be heard by Judge O'Donnell. The bench trial, again, expected to get underway here at the Justice Center at 9 o'clock.
At the time of the Michael Brelo trial, it was the most watched in Cleveland in years and gained a lot of local and national attention. According to an interview with Tim McGinty, the Cuyahoga County prosecutor, he stated that Officer Brelo started shooting again and fired at least 15 shots, including fatal shots, downward through the windshield into the victims at close range as he stood on the hood of Mr. Russell's car. There is no video of the shooting, so it took about 1.5 years to assemble the testimonies and expert witnesses he needed. The most important pieces of evidence include the autopsy results, the bullet-riddled windshield, an audio recorder that caught the ordeal, and a set of footprints left by Brelo. There's no doubt that there were some intense moments, including officers pleading the fifth to avoid self-incrimination.
What you're saying is then, where you make a subjective determination that a cop did not commit a crime, that based on what you think he did or didn't do, he doesn't have a Fifth Amendment right not to be compelled.
He swore an oath to the community of the city of Cleveland to not only under his general
to uphold
orders,
the Constitution, right?
Uphold the Constitution.
You know what's in the Constitution? The same amendment we're talking about.
But he doesn't have a right. He just doesn't have a real and appreciable right to, or a reason to assert that. And that's all the law says, and that's what our briefs have argued.
His appreciable right is sitting in a white shirt and a striped tie. Right.
He has an appreciable right.
He's in basically the same position, except clearly some of the evidence about him is going to be different than it is about Michael Brelo.
If his
The 2 counts of voluntary manslaughter that Brelo was charged with carried a maximum penalty of 22 years of prison if convicted. 5 other police supervisors were indicted for dereliction of duty. By May 23, 2015, Judge John P. O'Donnell shocked the world when he found Brelo not guilty of the charges.
And therefore find that Brelo's entire use of deadly force was a constitutionally reasonable response to an objectively reasonably perceived threat of great bodily harm from the occupants of the Malibu, Russell and Williams.
The defense attorney saw the prosecution as ruthless after the acquittal.
And the prosecution in this case spared no expense and was in fact ruthless. But notwithstanding that, we fought tooth and nail, as you saw in this courtroom. It was classically a case of David versus Goliath. And at the end, you saw lawyering at, I think, its very highest level in this courtroom. And I don't say that as a braggart.
Although the prosecution didn't win, there was no doubt that there would be some changes in the police department after this shooting.
This tragic experience has already forced a culture change within the Division of Police and a needed re-examination of the use of deadly force.
From the moment the news of the verdict broke, there were nationwide protests and criticisms. Most were based on the idea that the American justice system unfairly favors police who kill, especially when the victims were African American and most of the police officers involved were white.
No justice, no peace, no racist police. We want justice. We want justice. When do we want it? Now.
The people in the city of Cleveland feel it's time for some justice, just like they feel all over the country.
You still try to hold out hope that justice will be served, and it won't be just them and then just us.
We don't get rid of these guilty officers and make them guilty and make them serve their time for the crimes that they've committed, then all it's going to do is cause a lot of distrust in the community.
That don't mean you judge all the police, because we need them.
As the judge was delivering the verdict, there were peaceful protests occurring outside. Protesters held a mock funeral across the city while carrying signs that said, "Will I be next?" The Cleveland police had to heighten security to prevent any conflict after the verdict. After the verdict, there were violent protests and unrest in downtown Cleveland. This led to the arrest of 71 people on May 25th. They were mostly charged with felonious assault, rioting, and failure to disperse.
I'm not guilty. I wouldn't say no contest. That's giving them a right to say that I'm guilty. You know, if I'm already fighting for injustices, why would I not fight for myself in a court of law?
The families of Russell and Williams filed a lawsuit against the city of Cleveland. In November 2014, the city paid $3 million to the two families. There were even cases of people claiming to be half-siblings of the victims, so Cleveland had to carry out DNA testing before issuing the payout.
Well, initially when I saw it online, actually live, and initially I think that overall we were satisfied with the investigation results, but I think that it's more than just a systemic failure. I think it's more with officers not performing as they maybe have been trained.
Although Brelo was acquitted against popular opinion, many still thought some sort of justice was served when he was fired from his job at the Cleveland Police Department.
And new this morning, a resident who lives near the site where that chase ended explains why she wants more done.
One, this cannot stand. Two, it needs to go to the federal level. Three, this is not a war zone. And four, this is the United States of America.
On January 26, 2016, 6 of the officers involved, including Brelo, were fired. But by October 2017, 5 of them were reinstated. Only Brelo remained out of a job. In 2021, Netflix released a documentary titled 137 Shots. This was almost 10 years after the shooting and placed the spotlight on the ordeal again. The shooting of Russell and Williams triggered a widespread protest and anger against the Cleveland police, and the community's mistrust lingered for a long time. While Michael Brelo claimed he thought he was doing the right thing, the entire city of Cleveland was against him. What do you think about Brelo's perspective of what happened? And do you think the not guilty verdict was justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If there's a case you'd like us to cover, don't hesitate to share your suggestions in the comment section below.
It's one of the most enduring murder mysteries New Zealand's ever had.
The conviction was really questionable. I was concerned because of the attitude of the leading police in the search about they had one person in their sights.
On June 22, 1970, a terrifying call changed everything. A person reported a crying baby inside a house, but when police rushed to the house, they found a bloodbath. Despite their efforts, they could not locate the bodies of the child's parents. After months of investigation, they found some damning evidence. They couldn't have predicted that this homicide case would culminate in a whopping compensation of 950,000 New Zealand dollars and a royal pardon.
The review identifies that there is a distinct possibility that Exhibit 350 may be fabricated evidence, and that if this is the case, then a member of police would be responsible.
You don't give up when you know the man is innocent.
On June 22, 1970, Constable Wiley from Tuakau Police got a call around 2:20 p.m. The caller, Owen Priest, shared a story that seemed quite unbelievable. A blood-stained house that is deserted except for a crying baby. Some officers were sent to the house to understand the situation and rescue the baby. It turned out that the house was the Cruz farmhouse, and apart from the crying baby, the parents and owners of the house, Harvey and Jeanette Crew, were nowhere to be found. When the police tried to find more about the missing couple, they discovered Jeanette Lenore Denler was the older daughter of Mr. and Mrs. L.W. Denler. Growing up on the Pukakawa farm, she attended the local primary school and later completed her secondary education in Auckland. After training as a teacher, she taught in various locations in the North Island, including Maramarua and Whanganui, following her return from overseas travel in 1961-62. Her younger sister, Heather Demler, born in 1942, shared ownership of the Channel Estate, a farm inherited in 1950. They managed it until both sisters turned 25. Shortly thereafter, Jeanette met Harvey Crew, a native of a farming district in the lower North Island, while teaching in Wanganwea. The couple fell in love at first sight, marrying in June 1966. Harvey purchased Heather's half share of the Channel estate, making them joint owners. The farm, situated on Highway 22 with a house about 60 yards from the road, saw the Crews working tirelessly to boost efficiency and profitability. Despite making few friends in Pukekohe for over 4 years, the couple appeared content and happy, welcoming their daughter Rochelle on December 1, 1968. Following Jeanette's mother's death in February 1970, Leonard Demler, Jeanette's father, regularly joined the Crews for meals at their farm adjoining his on Highway 22. It was the 2-year-old Rochelle that the officers rescued when they first arrived at the house. The officers radioed the police department, confirmed the caller's story, and requested backup. Soon after, Inspector Bruce Hutton took charge of the case, and by 4 p.m. on June 22, 1970, he arrived at the house with a team of detectives. Over the following 7 weeks, they conducted an intense, thorough, and painstaking investigation. Despite the meticulous search, 2 critical aspects remained unresolved. The bodies of the couple hadn't been found, yet the numerous bloodstains and a bit of brain tissue on a chair suggested Mr. Harvey and Mrs. Jeanette likely met a grim fate. Initially, L.W. Demler, Jeanette's father, stood as Inspector Hutton's prime suspect. But despite the officers' efforts and investigations, they couldn't find any evidence against him. However, everything changed on August 16, 1970, when Jeanette's body was discovered in the Waikato River. 15 .22 caliber bullet fragments were recovered from her head, including one which bore a bold number 8 on its base. These fragments were sent to Dr. D.F. Nelson of the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, DSIR, who compared them with bullets test-fired from rifles gathered from the Crews family's relatives, associates, residents within a 5-mile radius of their farm, and others linked to the inquiry. Simultaneously, investigators searched the house and surrounding area again, looking for a .22 caliber cartridge case, even though both the house and the area had already been thoroughly searched in June. The police believed that there was more to the crime and were insistent on finding it out. Their investigation uncovered an old connection between Jeanette Crew and Arthur Thomas, prompting the collection of Mr. Arthur's .22 caliber rifle on August 17, 1970. Arthur Allan Thomas was born on January 1, 1938 in New Zealand. He grew up in a bustling household of 9 siblings, 4 brothers and 4 sisters. Arthur loved farm work and helped out in the family dairy farm. The Thomas family farm stood on Mercer Ferry Road, about 8 miles from their farming neighbors, Harvey and Jeanette Crew, who also have a farm. Arthur began his education at the nearby primary school, but he left at 14 after completing 6th grade. From there, he dived into work life, starting on his father's dairy farm before moving on to his uncle's farm. Having grown up working in the farm, Arthur wanted to try his hands at other jobs, so he joined Roosh Shipping Company as a laborer. After a brief period there, he explored forestry work in Maramarua and then switched to the Bar Brothers, a top-dressing firm. However, none of these jobs gave him the satisfaction that working on a farm brought, so he returned and continued his stint at the farm. In 1958, at age 20, Arthur fell in love with Vivian Carter, who had recently arrived from England and was staying with her uncle in Welsford. Later that year, on October 4, 1958, Arthur married Vivian. After their marriage, Arthur tried his hand at various farms until June 1966, when he signed a 5-year deal with his dad to run the family farm in Pukekohe. Arthur and his wife ran the place smoothly as they blended in with the local community, and they seemed like a picture of a happy, stable marriage. The arrival of their daughter also brought them closer. However, things didn't stay stable and smooth for long. Back to the investigation at the Crews farmhouse, where the detectives' unrelenting efforts led to the .22 rifle being obtained from the initial suspect, Leonard, since he wasn't registered as the owner. Despite a thorough investigation, the police couldn't establish that he had access to a .22 rifle around the time Harvey and Jeanette vanished. On August 19th, Dr. Nelson informed Mr. Hutton of his preliminary conclusion that neither Mr. Arthur's rifle or another owned by their other neighbor, the Eyre family, could be ruled out as the source of the fatal bullet. The final confirmation from Dr. Nelson came between October 13th and 16th, 1970. He pointed out that of the 64 rifles examined, only the Eyre and Arthur rifles couldn't be excluded as potential sources of the fatal bullets. However, during this discussion, Dr. Nelson highlighted a distinctive scoring mark in one of the 6 lands of bullets test-fired from Arthur's rifle, which wasn't found on the fatal bullets. Consequently, a definite match between the fatal bullets and Mr. Arthur's rifle couldn't be established. Dr. Nelson's notes indicated this limitation, but Inspector Hutton didn't agree with the doctor. As the investigations continued, Harvey Crew's body was discovered. Upon the recovery of Mr. Harvey's body, a car axle was found, seemingly used as a weight and tied to the body with wire. This axle, traced back to a 1928 or 29 model Nash motor car Series 420, had been in use on a trailer owned by Arthur's father until around August 1965. Around this time, 2 Christchurch police officers, Detective Inspector Baker and Detective Senior Sergeant O'Donovan, were dispatched to Auckland to review the Crew homicide file. They disagreed with the focus on Mr. Demler as the prime suspect by Mr. Hutton's team, encouraging a broader exploration of leads. Over a 2-week period starting from October 13, 1970, the investigating team shifted their attention away from Mr. Demler and significantly built a case against Arthur Thomas. On October 13th, Officer Johnson found an uncounted box of .22 ammunition from Arthur's farm. It seemed he also visited a tip or trailer on the farm that day, presumably for parts connected to the axle. That evening, a police reconstruction took place showing the potential scenario of Mr. Harvey being shot. The imagined scene involved the shooter positioned outside the house, firing through the louvered windows with one foot on a brick parapet near the back door steps and the other on the windowsill. On October 14, 1970, other members of the Arthur Thomas family were interviewed regarding the axle. The following day, October 15th, Officer Johnson returned to Arthur's farm, this time in search of trailer parts, and got a statement personally written by Arthur. On October 20th, Officer Johnson, accompanied by Detective Parks, located 2 stub axles in one of the 3 tips on the farm. These axles had been welded at either end of the main axle. Officer Johnson also collected wire samples to be analyzed and compared with wire taken from the bodies. On October 20th, Arthur's rifle was once again taken by the police. Evidence from the priest's couple suggested that between September 30th, 1970 and October 27th, 1970, 2 shots were fired by Officer Hutton and another police officer, likely Officer Johnson, at the Crew house. The police delved into Mr. Arthur's financial affairs on October 23rd and 24th. Finally, on October 27, 1970, Detective Sergeants Charles and Parks were sent to the Crew farm to search a garden area beside the fence outside the back door. They aimed to find a shell casing, assuming that if Mr. Harvey's murder followed the reconstruction scenario of October 13th, a shell casing might have been ejected from the rifle into that garden. Despite the garden being searched twice before, the detectives discovered a shell casing, later designated as Exhibit 350, within 2 hours of initiating the search. Subsequently, on November 11, 1970, Arthur Thomas was arrested and charged with the murders of Mr. and Mrs. Crew. Mr. Arthur made his first court appearance on November 11, 1970, following remand in custody until November 25, 1970, and later to December 14th for the taking of depositions. The lower court hearing concluded on December 22, 1970. That same day, he was committed to the Supreme Court for trial on both charges. The Crown's case against Arthur, presented at the deposition hearing in the 2 trials, included the following points. 1. Alleged motive based on jealousy to kill Mr. and Mrs. Crew. 2. The assertion that both fatal bullets could have been fired from Mr. Arthur's rifle. 3. The claim that the cartridge case, Exhibit 350, found by Detective Sergeant Charles on October 27, 1970, had undoubtedly been fired by Mr. Arthur's rifle. 4. The connection between the axle found beneath Mr. Harvey's body, according to Mr. A.G. Thomas, and the 2 stub axles found in the Arthur tip by Detective Johnson on October 20, 1970. 5. Wire samples from Mr. Arthur's farm aligning with the wire used to bind the 2 bodies, distinct from wire samples from other farms, including Mr. Demler's. The initial trial occurred between February 15th and March 2, 1971. The jury found him guilty on both counts. Despite an appeal to the Court of Appeal, it was dismissed on June 18, 1971. In late 1971, Arthur's father, Mr. A.G. Thomas, and his close friend P.G.F. Vesey submitted a petition to the Governor General under Section 406 of the Crimes Act 1961, seeking a new trial. Sir George McGregor, a retired judge of the Supreme Court, considered the material and, in his report on February 2, 1972, expressed the view that no further reference to the court should be granted, as there had been no miscarriage of justice. Despite this recommendation, a second petition in June 1972 led to the matter being presented to the Court of Appeal in what's known as the first referral. Evidence and submissions were heard between February 5th and 16th, 1973. On February 26, 1973, the Court of Appeal ordered a second trial. The second trial commenced on March 26, 1973, and concluded on April 16th, with Mr. Arthur convicted of both murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. An appeal against the second conviction was dismissed by the Court of Appeal on July 11, 1973. Throughout, Arthur's case garnered widespread publicity and public concern. Dr. T.J. Sprott, a leading forensic scientist, had provided evidence on Mr. Arthur's behalf during the second trial. Post-trial, Dr. Sprott, along with his colleague, Mr. P.J. Booth, initiated an inquiry into whether the cartridge case, termed Exhibit 350, found by Detective Sergeant Charles, had any connection with the bullets found in the heads of Mr. and Mrs. Crew. Efforts by Dr. Sprott and Mr. Booth led to another petition to the Governor General, resulting in the case being referred to the Court of Appeal for the second time. The hearing occurred from December 9, 1974 to January 8, 1975. On January 29, 1975, the 5 judges of the Court of Appeal delivered a unanimous judgment stating that Arthur had not ruled out a reasonable possibility that Exhibit 350 contained a pattern 8 bullet. Following the consistently failed appeals, Arthur's wife Vivian divorced him. However, she continued to stand beside him and showed her support despite the divorce. In an attempt to appeal from the judgment of the Court of Appeal at the second referral to the Privy Council, the Privy Council, in its Reasons for Judgment dated July 4, 1978, advised that it had no jurisdiction to entertain such an appeal. Unyielding in their efforts, Dr. Sprott and Mr. Booth continued their investigation into the cartridge case question. Mr. Booth authored a book, Trial by Ambush, and Dr. Sprott and Mr. Booth jointly published The ABC of Injustice. In 1978, British author David Yallop took an interest in the case, writing the book Beyond Reasonable Doubt. He expressed his belief in Arthur's innocence and argued that his conviction amounted to a serious miscarriage of justice. The allegations prompted the Prime Minister to appoint Adam Smith to look into the case. The Royal Commission of Inquiry, led by retired New South Wales Justice Robert Taylor, unequivocally declared that Mr. Arthur had been wrongfully charged and convicted. Among the discovered improprieties, the Commission revealed that the police had planted a .22 caliber rifle cartridge case in the garden of the murder scene. This was suspected to be the 2 shots fired by Mr. Hutton and another police officer, likely Mr. Johnson, at the Crew house. Mr. Adam Smith submitted 2 reports on January 16, 1979 and around December 1979. That December, following the second report, Arthur received a free pardon under Section 407 of the Crimes Act 1961. After the disclosure that crucial evidence against him had been fabricated, Arthur received 950,000 New Zealand dollars in compensation for the 9 years he spent in prison and the loss of earnings during that time. Despite the Commission's clear statement that Officer Hutton and Officer Len Johnson planted the shell case to manufacture evidence that Arthur's rifle had been used for the killings, no action was taken against the police officers. The Solicitor General recommended against prosecuting them, citing insufficient evidence. However, an independent review of the 2014 Police Review by David P.H. Jones QC, released on July 30, 2014, claimed that there was enough evidence for prosecution against Bruce Hutton based on the available material. In 2010, he collaborated with investigative journalist Ian Wishart on the book Arthur Allan Thomas, providing his perspective on his life from before the murders to the present. The detectives responsible for planting the shell that played a role in Arthur's conviction have since passed away. Len Johnson died in 1978, and Bruce Hutton, aged 83, passed away in Middlemore Hospital in April 2013. At Hutton's funeral, Deputy Commissioner Mike Bush praised him, stating he had integrity beyond reproach, a sentiment criticized as absurd by an editorial in the New Zealand Herald. Arthur, then 75, responded, alleging a blatant cover-up by the police. In July 2014, a police review of the original investigation, costing $400,000 to New Zealand taxpayers, cleared all other suspects and subtly suggested that Arthur Thomas remained a police suspect. An independent review by David P.H. Jones QC concluded that it does not appear that there was any real inquiry into the 1970 investigation team into any persons other than Arthur Thomas. As recently as 2014, prompted by Rochelle Crew's insistence, the police released a new report on the case, While they issued an apology to the Crew family, no such acknowledgement was extended to Arthur Allan Thomas. Hence, after 45 years, the unfortunate reality persists that the only individual who served time in prison for the murders of Jeanette and Harvey Crew was innocent. Arthur Allan Thomas's story highlights the critical need for thorough and unbiased scrutiny in criminal investigations. Inadequate oversight, confirmation bias, and a rush to judgment can result in miscarriages of justice. Do you think that the 950,000 New Zealand dollars was enough compensation for the 9 years Arthur spent in prison? Do you accept that the crooked officers were only misguided? Let us know what you think in the comments section.
Today, we acknowledge a mistake was made. We will dismiss this case with prejudice.
19 years old, 19 years stolen. Darryl Hunt's life was turned upside down by a wrongful conviction. He was arrested on September 11, 1984 for assault and murder of a 25-year-old woman, Deborah Sykes. Evidence, testimonies, and investigation, everything was against him, and the reason was racism.
I do not believe in Mr. Hunt's innocence. And I believe that what you're about to do here today is set free a guilty man who's guilty of my daughter's death.
Darryl Hunt's youth was consumed by prison walls. Freed, but not free, he grappled with PTSD and the weight of lost years. He slipped into depression, lost his friends and family, and ultimately decided to give up on his life.
From day one, I told him I was innocent. And the question has always been, was anybody listening?
It was just another normal day for 25-year-old Deborah Sykes as she made her way to Winston-Salem's Sentinel newspaper on the morning of August 10, 1984, where she served as a copy editor. Deborah usually parked near the Crystal Towers apartment area before heading to work, but on this fateful day, she chose to park her car at a different location for unknown reasons. By 6:53 a.m., a caller who identified himself as Sammy Mitchell phoned the police and reported an attack against a white woman around the downtown fire station. Unfortunately, the responder to the call had written the wrong address and led police officers to a different location. About 6 hours after the call, the police received another emergency call from a factory worker, Brian Keith Watts, who had gone for his lunch break and cited the gory scene of a murder. The victim was lying on her side, naked from the waist down, with blood all over her body in a field near Crystal Towers. There was sign of a struggle with matted grass around the area. On checking the strewn belongings from the victim's bag, she was identified as Deborah Sykes. The community was overcome with hysteria, finding it unimaginable that a crime of such a nature occurred not just near a bustling work district, but also in broad daylight. Winston-Salem police promptly started the investigation into the case, which swiftly garnered public attention and took on a racial undertone. An autopsy was conducted on Deborah's remains, revealing signs of assault in the attack, including the presence of biological male fluid. Dr. Mark Nelson from the State Bureau of Investigation Laboratory pointed out that the blood group of the biological fluid found on Deborah was a type O secretor. The assailant had inflicted more than 15 stab wounds with a penknife, and the fatal thrust punctured Deborah's heart. Her time of death was estimated to be between 5:30 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. on August 10, 1984. On the same day of the murder, several witnesses came to the police claiming they'd seen Deborah with a black man that morning. One of the witnesses was Thomas Murphy, who told police he saw Deborah with two black men, one with an arm around her neck. Another witness, William Hooper, who worked at the Haynes Dye and Finishing plant at the base of the hill that ran behind Crystal Towers, also reported that he saw two black males with a white female at around 6:20 a.m. He reported that one of the black males kissed her on the lips while the other shook his fist at her. William said he didn't report it because it didn't seem the woman was in trouble. Police also went in search of Sammy Mitchell, who first called in to report the incident. A few days after the murder, Detective Jim Dalton, the lead investigator, caught up with Sammy and also met his friend, 19-year-old Darryl Hunt. Detective Dalton played a snippet of the 911 call to the men, and it was clearly not Sammy's voice. Darryl also claimed that Sammy didn't report the crime to the police and that Sammy was with him around the time that the 911 call was made. On August 22, 1984, the initial informant who called in as Sammy Mitchell reached out to the police again, this time identifying himself as Johnny Gray. It wasn't clear why Johnny initially chose to provide a false identity. According to Johnny, he heard a woman yelling that morning and saw a black man straddling and assaulting a naked white woman. Johnny claimed he fled the scene to avoid trouble, but got a good look at the man's face. After the scuffle between the black man and the white woman, Johnny claimed that he saw the murder suspect board the bus. In a photo lineup, Johnny identified Terry Thomas as the man he'd seen entering the bus that day. However, Terry had a strong alibi. He'd been in jail at the time of the murder, and police were able to confirm his claim. On August 24, 1984, one of the first witnesses, Thomas Murphy, contacted investigators and told them that he sighted the same black male suspect again in the neighborhood. However, no arrest was made as the said suspect wasn't found. On August 29, 1984, the police received information from street sources and through its Crime Stopper program that the two men, Sammy and Darryl, had been suspiciously discussing the crime. The police invited them for another round of questioning and inquired about their whereabouts on August 10, 1984. Darryl claimed he'd been with his girlfriend, Margaret Crawford, at a motel located at 1905 Dunleith Avenue until 10:30 a.m. on August 10, 1984. Sammy supported Darryl's statement, stating that he'd also been at the motel with another woman that morning. 14-year-old Margaret was an underage prostitute who had an outstanding charge of larceny. Ironically, this alibi that was supposed to help Darryl would instead seal his fate forever. When questioned, she said that she was with Darryl and Sammy at Motel 6 on the day of the murder. Afterward, she was arrested for larceny and failure to appear. With the threat of punishment hanging over her head, Margaret decided to give a statement against Darryl. Margaret stated that she'd spent the night of August 9th and the morning of August 10th, 1984 with Darryl. However, she claimed that he left at 6 a.m. for about 3 hours, returning at 9:30 a.m. On his return, Margaret said Darryl looked nervous and had dirt and grass stains on the knees of his pants. Margaret also said Darryl told her that Sammy killed and assaulted Deborah. On the night of September 11th, 1984, police arrested Darryl on the charge of taking indecent liberties with a minor because of his relationship with 14-year-old Margaret. After Darryl's arrest, investigators began to question him regarding Deborah's murder. Darryl maintained that he was nowhere near the crime scene at the time of the incident. He also denied knowing the real culprit. He was subjected to a polygraph test and he passed. Afterward, Darryl was put in the lineup of suspects for Deborah's murder. On September 12, 1984, Thomas Murphy was invited to view the lineup, which now included Darryl. He identified Darryl as the suspect. The other witness, William, also viewed the lineup but couldn't identify the suspect. On September 14, 1984, Darryl Hunt was charged with the murder of Deborah Sykes. Darryl's murder trial commenced in May 1985 at Forsyth County Superior Court. The proceedings were highly publicized and a large number of community members were in attendance. Darryl was represented by two lawyers, Gordon Jenkins and Mark Rabil, while Judge Preston Cornelius presided over the case. This is the moment when it all comes to the end of all the labor they did all these years. During the arraignment, Darryl pleaded not guilty to the crime. However, from the proceedings and public opinion, it was clear that the law enforcement, prosecutors, and the majority of the city's residents already deemed him guilty. Brenda Dew, a medical technologist with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, SBI, testified regarding the forensic evidence gathered on the scene and during the autopsy. The analyses led to the conclusion that a secretor belonging to the type O blood group perpetrated the attack. When Darryl was tested, he was type B. Interestingly, Drew, however, stated that while the evidence does not pin Darryl as the culprit, it also doesn't exclude him either. Another expert witness, Dr. Lou Stringer, a medical examiner, expressed the opinion that more than one person participated in the attack. He said that while Deborah's body was found about 10 yards from her shoes in an area strewn with broken glass, her feet had no cuts. Stringer pointed out that this fact meant Deborah was either carried or dragged, possibly during a struggle. The other witnesses who saw the incident leading to the murder also testified and mostly confirmed the statement that they'd earlier given to the police. Johnny, who called in for the crime, said he made up a fake name just to avoid getting involved with the case. Shortly after Darryl's arrest, a worker at Hyatt Hotel near the crime scene named Roger Weaver approached the police about a sighting on the day of the murder. Weaver testified during the trial that Darryl frequently came to the hotel to use its facilities, but always sought permission. Strangely, Weaver said on August 10, 1984, at about 6 a.m., Darryl had entered the hotel's bathroom without permission, almost as if he was in a rush. Weaver said Darryl remained there for a considerably long period of time before he left. Afterward, Weaver said he went to inspect the bathrooms and cited pinkish red liquid on the floor and sink. Margaret Crawford also testified in the matter, but against Darryl. She first recanted her statement, which implicated Darryl in the murder, then later said she couldn't remember whether she'd given the police a statement. While the defense counsel objected to the admission of her statement during the trial, Judge Cornelius overruled the objection and allowed the unsworn statements to be read to the jury. On the other hand, Sammy testified in support of Darryl, maintaining that they were both together at the time of the crime. The case became racially charged, leading the black community in Winston-Salem to organize numerous rallies demanding a fair trial for Darryl. This concern heightened as the jury was predominantly white, with only one black juror. On June 14, 1985, following 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Darryl guilty of first-degree murder and subsequently recommended a life sentence instead of the death penalty. Immediately after his sentencing, Darryl began another process to prove his innocence. He filed an appeal specifically arguing against Judge Cornelius's decision to allow Margaret's unsworn statement to be used at trial. The appeal also said that Darryl's right to counsel was violated because his attorneys weren't allowed to be present when the hotel witness, Weaver, viewed Darryl in a lineup. On May 4, 1989, the North Carolina Supreme Court, in a 5-2 ruling, granted Darryl a new trial. Darryl's second trial for the murder of Deborah Sykes began in September 1990. Due to the fact that the first trial would have tainted the opinion of possible jurors in Forsyth County, Darryl's attorneys asked for a change of venue. A judge granted the request, but the new location was in Catawba County, which was even more conservative and less diverse than Forsyth County. While jurors at the first trial at least had one black member, the second set of jurors were all white with the exception of a Hispanic member. The second trial featured most of the former witnesses, who mostly repeated their statements, but with new variations. In the earlier trial, Johnny said he put down the numbers 1 and 4 from the lineup because the person in position 1 looked like the man he saw at the bottom of the hill near the crime scene. At the second trial, he testified that he wrote 1-4 because Darryl, who was in position 4 at the trial, was the number 1 suspect. Margaret changed her testimony again during the new trial as well. This time she claimed that while they both were tired together that night, Darryl was not in bed when she woke up. She also claimed that Darryl told her that he and Sammy had just wanted to rob Deborah, not kill her. Thomas Murphy also changed his statement again during the retrial. While he earlier claimed that he'd seen about 2 men near the crime scene on that morning, at the second trial, he said there were perhaps 3 or 4 men within the area of the scene. He also claimed that he'd seen Johnny at the crime scene and that he only recognized him after seeing him at the first trial. As part of the defense, Darryl's lawyer disputed Thomas's testimony, bringing up the fact that he was a former member of the infamous Ku Klux Klan, a group which is widely known for enforcing the ideology of white supremacy and racial discrimination in America. Thomas said he left the racist organization due to conflicting religious beliefs, but still remained friends with some of the members. Prosecutors also presented new witnesses in the second trial. 2 of them were Darryl's inmates at the prison who claimed Darryl had confessed to them about the crime. One said Darryl had told him his greatest mistake was going to clean his hands at the hotel washroom after he committed the crime. A new eyewitness, Edward Reese, claimed he'd been driving along Crystal Towers on the morning of the murder. Edward said as he drove out, he saw Sammy, who was an acquaintance, walking alone briskly in a driveway. Edward said he called out to Sammy, but he didn't respond. Another new eyewitness, Kevy Coleman, also testified in the new trial. He claimed he'd seen 2 roughly dressed black men with a white woman as he walked home from his night shift on the morning of August 10, 1984. He said he heard the woman scream just as he got into his house. While he claimed Darryl looked like one of the assailants, He admitted that he had bad eyesight and wasn't wearing his contact lenses that morning. On October 11, 1990, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Darryl, again finding him guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Farrell resentenced him to life in prison. Again, Darryl headed to appeals, claiming that the judge erred by allowing testimony given by himself and Sammy in the first trial to be read to jurors in the second trial. His counsels also argued that a report by the city of Winston-Salem revealed several shortcomings of the investigation, but the report was never admitted as evidence in the second trial. The North Carolina Supreme Court ordered a hearing on this new evidence. An order was also given for a DNA test, which was starting to gain popularity in the American justice system at the time. A final twist was about to snap the legal grip around Darryl and pose a possibility of his freedom. In November 1994, Roche Biomedical Laboratories reported its findings on DNA testing. The conclusion from the analyses was that Darryl was not a match for Deborah's assailant. Darryl's attorneys quickly filed a motion for a new trial based on this new definitive evidence. However, prosecutors argued that Sammy could have been the one who carried out the assault, while Darryl was an accomplice to the murder. Sammy was therefore also subjected to a test to see if he matched the perpetrator's DNA. When the results finally came out, Sammy was discovered not to be a match. However, Judge Morgan upheld the conviction, stating that the DNA results did not meet a critical standard used by North Carolina courts in evaluating the evidence because the results were unlikely to have changed the jury's verdict. Judge Morgan also stated that it was possible that Darryl had assaulted Deborah without releasing biological fluid in the act, or that he'd also helped an unknown person in the assault and murder of Deborah. Hence, the North Carolina Supreme Court, in a 4-3 decision, affirmed the initial conviction on December 30th, 1994. However, Darryl and his legal team did not give up. They continued to explore means of redress with no success. Motions, petitions, and appeals were filed even up to the United States Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. By April 2003, Darryl's lawyers had run out of appeals to file. As a last attempt to find justice for Darryl, his attorney filed a motion asking the state to place the DNA evidence found on the crime scene in the state's database. Judge Anderson Cromer granted the motion. The prosecution didn't carry out this order, but dragged its feet for several months. It wasn't until Judge Comer threatened to hold the officials in contempt of court that they ran the DNA test in early December 2003. The search turned up a partial match, which led investigators to a relative of the perpetrator. This new discovery eventually led investigators to Willard E. Brown, who was invited for questioning. While he was in the police station, a cigarette butt was obtained from him. His DNA was tested and turned out to be a match with the DNA found at the crime scene. When confronted with evidence, Brown confessed to the stabbing and assault of Deborah on the morning of August 10, 1994. Notably, Darryl and Brown had a lot of similarities. Both were dark-skinned black men. Brown was 24 and Hunt was 19 at the time of the murder. Brown was 5'7" and weighed 130 pounds, while Hunt was 5'10" and weighed about 150 pounds. 5 days after Brown made the confession on December 24, 2003, Darryl was released from custody. On February 6, 2004, the state formally dismissed the first-degree murder charge against Darryl.
Today, we acknowledge a mistake was made. We will dismiss this case with prejudice.
Despite the fact that a new culprit who confessed to the crime had been identified, Evelyn Jefferson, Deborah's mother, spoke against Darryl's release. She told the judge,
I do not believe in Mr. Hunt's innocence. And I believe that what you're about to do here today is set free a guilty man who's guilty of my daughter's death.
However, Darryl responded with warmth to her accusation and consoled her. Darryl said he didn't have much hope for release due to the roller coaster of the last 19 years. He then turned to Evelyn and said, Mrs. Jefferson, I had nothing to do with your daughter's death. I wasn't involved. I know it's hard. I just ask that you and your family know that in my heart and my prayers, that you are in my prayers. Darryl's release was met with joy in his community, which had also been affected by the much-publicized trial. Darryl had become a Muslim during his stay in prison and had a community of other Muslims who supported him. He'd met a woman, April, while he was out of prison on bond between 1989 and 1990 as he awaited his second trial. Both had become close, and she continued to visit him when he was incarcerated after the retrial in 1994. They got married while he was still in prison. Darryl received a pardon from the state governor, Mike Easley, on April 15th. He also received a settlement of $358,545 under the state law that provides $20,000 for every year of wrongful imprisonment. Darryl's lawyers filed a federal suit against the state of North Carolina over the wrongful conviction. On February 19, 2007, Winston-Salem chose to settle the case and awarded Darryl $1.65 million as compensation for his wrongful conviction. The settlements he received were turned into a noble cause. He established the Darryl Hunt Project for Freedom and Justice to help ex-convicts integrate back into society. He also went on speaking engagements across the country where he challenged the issue of racial injustice in the American justice system. While Darryl was finally free from the concrete walls and the metal bars of prison, his mind was still trapped in a cage he couldn't set himself free from. His close friends and family noticed he exhibited traits of someone suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. He'd have panic attacks when he cited certain things that reminded him of jail. He was always alert and looking over his shoulder. He'd frequently use the ATM just to have a record of where he was at a particular time. Darryl soon slipped into depression. His wife, April, noted that he started using substances, especially cocaine, to cope with his mental issues. This caused a rift in their marriage as Darryl became aggressive and abusive. This eventually led to their separation in September 2014. By December 30, 2015, their divorce was made final. However, Darryl still kept in contact with April. He'd write her letters and express his undying love for her in text messages. He also apologized for how their relationship ended due to his shortcomings. On March 4, 2016, Darryl borrowed his friend's pickup truck for a drive. This was because his own assets, including his truck, had been tied up in the property settlement during the divorce. After his drive, Darryl went missing. For 9 days, he couldn't be contacted, and his family had to file a missing persons report. On March 13, 2016, the said pickup truck was found in a neighborhood in Winston-Salem. Darryl was found dead inside the truck with a .38 caliber gun on his legs. A journal entry dated March 4, 2016 at 1:25 p.m. was found in the car. An autopsy showed that the bullet traveled from Darryl's abdomen through his heart and lung to lodge in his left shoulder. He died almost immediately from the self-inflicted wound. At the age of 51, the tragic story of Darryl Hunt came to an end as he sought silence from 3 decades of torment. His story continues to inspire change in the American criminal justice system.
From day one, I told him I was innocent. And the question has always been, was anybody listening?
The story of Darryl Hunt serves as a reminder of the impact wrongful conviction can have on a person. Despite being free from all charges, Darryl's life continued on a downward spiral. After 2 wrongful convictions and serving time in prison, Darryl remained trapped in his mind, becoming aloof from society, friends, and family. Even though the community rejoiced at his release, he himself could not recover from the trauma faced for the past 2 decades. His case continues to serve as a reminder to the American criminal justice system to always practice caution and advocate fair trials so that such a case may not repeat again. On September 23, 1998, Anthony Porter, a 44-year-old man, was facing execution for a double murder that had occurred 16 years earlier. The public was deeply divided, with some believing he was guilty and others convinced of his innocence. As his execution date loomed just 2 days away, his defense team was in a race against time, doing everything possible to gather evidence in his favor. Anthony had nearly lost hope and was even contemplating his last meal. However, just when nothing was possible anymore, a piece of hidden information came to light, and it changed everything. It was a warm summer night in Chicago on August 14, 1982. It was the night of the Bud Billiken Parade and Picnic, a huge celebration for the African American community. Even into the early hours of August 15th, the excitement continued at Washington Park. The weather was hot and everyone was trying to cool down. Joining in the festivities that night were two young lovebirds, 19-year-old Marilyn Green and 18-year-old Jerry Hillard, who were in love and planning to get married. They decided to have a little adventure by sneaking into the pool area at Washington Park, and they found their way to the top of the bleachers on the western side of the pool, enjoying their time together. As the night got closer to 1 a.m., a dreadful event unfolded. A person with a gun approached the young couple and fired shots with a .38 caliber revolver. Jerry was hit in the head by 2 bullets, and Marilyn, in her attempt to shield herself, was shot twice in the neck and once in the hand. With blood flowing from her wounds, Marilyn somehow managed to leave the park holding her neck with her hand and pointing the left hand in the air, indicating the direction the killer had run away to. Luckily, there was a patrol car nearby with Officer Anthony Liacci in it, who responded to the shots fired call. He'd stopped a young black man running from the scene, but there were more pressing matters to attend to. Marilyn was practically carrying her head at that point. She was immediately taken to the hospital, but the injuries were just too severe, and she passed away before the sun came up. Detectives Geraldine Perry and Dennis Dwyer initiated an investigation into the double murder of Jerry Hillard and Marilyn Green. They understood that there were too many people around for the killer to have escaped unnoticed. Focusing on potential witnesses William Taylor and Henry Williams, who were near the bleachers, the detectives brought them to the precinct for questioning. There, their case was assigned to Detective Charles Salvatore and his longtime partner, Detective Dennis Gray. Medical examiner Joanne Richmond determined Marilyn's cause of death as severe blood loss, while Jerry's fatal headshot wound indicated no chance of survival. A mysterious black powdery substance on Jerry's hand raised further questions. Back at the station, questioning began for Henry Williams, who told the detectives that on the night of the double murder, he'd been mugged by a man named Anthony Porter. Born on December 14, 1954, Anthony Porter, raised by a single mother in a housing project, had 8 siblings. He was a familiar face to police. He was involved in criminal activities as a Cobra Stones gang member and was known for robbing in Washington Park. On probation in 1979, he violated it with a robbery. After admitting guilt in 1980, he served a 1-year prison term and 2 years on parole. During parole, he pointed a gun at a man named Earl Lewis, resulting in a gun incident and a subsequent jail term for aggravated battery. Anthony was sent to jail again. In the interrogation room, witness Williams initially described a gun incident involving Anthony, but didn't witness the shooting. Another witness, Taylor, initially claimed not to see the perpetrator, but later changed his story, identifying Anthony after prolonged questioning. Despite lack of proof, Anthony was arrested. Now it was all dependent on the courthouse battle between the prosecutors and his defense team. Back in the interrogation room, one of the main witnesses, Williams, explained that Anthony pointed a gun at him and took $2. Then he saw Anthony going up to the bleachers, but didn't witness the actual shooting. But that wasn't the end of it. He said that his friend William Taylor had seen a man kill Jerry and Marilyn. However, there was just one problem. Taylor was too scared of Anthony Porter to talk. The detectives took the 2 witnesses to a fried chicken place called Harold's. During their meal, Taylor said he didn't see the person who did it, but later at the police station, he changed his story. After 17 hours of questioning, Taylor's story went from not seeing the person responsible to clearly stating he saw Anthony shoot the victims. The police had already zeroed in on Anthony Porter, who they believed was the real killer. When he heard the police brought up his name in relation to the shootings, he thought the best thing to do was to go to the police station to prove he had nothing to do with it. But instead of being set free, Anthony was arrested. He denied having anything to do with the incident, and there was no actual proof linking him to the crime, but there was nothing he could do. Now it was all dependent on the courthouse battle between the prosecutors and his defense team. In court, prosecutor Paul C. Getvari presented 14 witnesses, including Henry Williams, who spoke of being robbed by Anthony, and William Taylor, who testified about seeing Anthony shoot Jerry Hillard, but clarified he didn't witness Marilyn's murder. Patrolman Anthony Liacci suggested Anthony might have been the runner he encountered, but never filed a report, leaving the gun's whereabouts uncertain. He also didn't find a gun on the person he thought was Anthony, implying that if this individual was the real killer of Jerry and Marilyn, they'd managed to hide the weapon somewhere in the pool area and the police had failed to locate it. Even though he was eligible for a public defender, his family had decided to hire a private lawyer, Akeem Gursil, for $10,000, but they could only pay him $3,000. Even so, the defense, led by Anthony's attorney Akeem Gursil, was well prepared for the trial. They had strong testimony from Georgia Moody, who was the longtime girlfriend of one of Anthony's brothers. Moody's testimony placed Anthony at his mother's apartment all day on August 14, 1982. She stated that he didn't leave until around 2:30 a.m. on August 15th. Another defense witness, Anthony's friend Kenneth Doyle, confirmed that Anthony was at the apartment and mentioned that they went to a nearby Project House playground together, where they continued drinking until dawn. Doyle also emphasized that he, Jerry Hillard, and Anthony Porter were all members of the Cobra Stones gang. He questioned why one member would kill another. Anthony's defense team really thought they would win the case, but they couldn't have been more wrong. In September of 1983, after discussing for 9 long hours, the jury declared Anthony guilty of 2 murder charges, as well as armed robbery, unlawful restraint, and 2 counts for unlawfully using weapons. Consequently, on September 9, 1983, Anthony Porter was sentenced to death. He was then transferred to Maynard Correctional Center downstate, where the notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy was in a nearby cell. But neither Anthony nor his family could just sit around and wait for the execution. They wanted to make appeals. Kenneth Flaxman, the experienced lawyer who took on Anthony Porter's case on appeal, saw many problems with the initial conviction. There was no solid evidence, no murder weapon, and Anthony had always said he was innocent. The eyewitness testimonies were not very convincing and seemed like they might have been influenced or forced. Everything was based on flimsy circumstantial evidence. But Flaxman had a theory. The police were determined to put Anthony behind bars and had used this case to achieve just that. Over 10 years, he'd filed several legal motions, direct appeal, writ of habeas corpus, petition for post-conviction relief, but all were rejected. By 1998, it seemed like Anthony had run out of options. The state had set a date for his execution. It was going to be September 23, 1998. Anthony's family was desperate, and they turned to a young attorney named Daniel Sanders for help. Sanders had graduated from law school a few years earlier, and he'd taken on various legal jobs, even working on appeals for death row cases because they paid well. He agreed to represent him for a fee of $25,000. It's unknown how this fee was supposed to be paid. Sanders reached out to another lawyer, Aviva Futorian, for guidance, as he was less experienced with death penalty law. Futorian encouraged him to get an evaluation of Anthony's mental abilities. If Sanders could show that Anthony had mental disabilities, meaning he couldn't fully understand his involvement or lack thereof in the shooting, it could potentially save Anthony from the death penalty. Only a few hours were left before his scheduled execution. 4 additional volunteer lawyers, including Sanders, took up Anthony's case and had his IQ tested, which turned out to be 51, indicating intellectual disability. At that time, it was still legal to execute someone with intellectual disabilities, but Anthony's legal team argued that his limited mental capacity meant he couldn't fully grasp the consequences of his punishment, making him ineligible for execution. Only 50 hours before his scheduled execution, the Illinois Supreme Court granted a temporary halt. This was a relief, but the execution could potentially continue if they didn't build a strong case. In late August 1998, Aviva Futorian, who knew Professor David Protas from previous wrongful conviction cases, reached out to him. He declined to take on the case. However, things took a positive turn when the Illinois Supreme Court's decision came for a hearing on Anthony's mental competency and granted a 4-month stay of execution. Futorian updated Protas on these developments, and he scheduled the case for his next seminar, The News Media and Capital Punishment. In the fall of 1998, Professor Protas's class of 16 had an interesting choice to make. They could pick from 4 different cases to work on, but one of them was particularly tricky because it was a new case. 4 students named Sean Armbruster, Lori D'Angelo, Tom McCann, and Kara Rubinski stepped up to take on this challenge. Professor Protas gave them some documents and phone numbers, hoping they'd be able to get some information. Their mission was to dig into the case of Marilyn Green and Jerry Hillard, a case that was 16 years old. But Professor Protas was upfront about the uncertainty of saving Anthony Porter from execution. Yet the students were determined. As they delved into police reports and court records, they became convinced that Anthony Porter deserved a fresh trial. They started by visiting Daniel Sanders, Anthony's lawyer, who'd been conducting his own research. Among the stacks of documents he'd examined, they discovered a significant set of papers. Ken Flaxman, who'd previously represented Porter, had gathered many sworn statements from people connected to Marilyn Green and Jerry Hillard. At each stage, the case was getting trickier, and this was just the start. In those documents, they found hidden clues. A witness named Joyce Haywood revealed that Jerry and Marilyn had gone to the park with Inez Jackson and her boyfriend. Ofra Green, Marilyn Green's mother, suggested to the police that Inez Jackson, who knew Marilyn, might have lured her to Washington Park to set her up for a robbery. She also mentioned that she believed Inez's boyfriend was the one who shot Marilyn and Jerry. She believed Inez's boyfriend had a conflict with Jerry over drug money. She also remembered seeing Inez and her boyfriend with Marilyn and Jerry earlier that evening. For the detectives who were carrying out this initial investigation, this was yet another angle to check. However, this task would prove to be very difficult. Before the shootings, Inez lived in a building on South Federal Street in Chicago with her 4 children. The day after the shooting, she moved away from the housing project. Marilyn's mother, Ofra, didn't know where Inez was at that time or if she was still alive. The same went for her boyfriend. Another witness, Ricky Young, had also testified that Jerry was involved in selling drugs for Inez's boyfriend, and there'd been a dispute over drug money. Several other witnesses confirmed this version of events. The case was getting even more complicated, but soon the detectives found out the name of Inez's boyfriend. It was Alstory Simon. Like Inez, Alstory had apparently left Chicago after the murders. After some efforts, the police were able to track them both down. The officers started questioning Inez and Alstory, but they had only shown them a photo of Anthony and asked if they had information about the crime. Alstory and Inez claimed they weren't at Washington Park on the evening of the crime. At this, the officers decided to not only wrap up this line of questioning, but also dust any and every suspicion on them under the carpet. Inez and Alstory were never interviewed again, and they moved to Milwaukee a few days later. After these developments in the case, when Professor Protas noticed that they were making progress, he decided to bring in a private investigator, Paul Ciolino, to speak with William Taylor, who was one of the main witnesses. Paul Ciolino, accompanied by one of the students, Tom, went to Taylor's house where he confessed everything. On December 14, 1998, Taylor provided a sworn statement stating that he had not seen Anthony Porter shoot anyone at Washington Park's pool that evening, and that the Chicago Police Department had pressured, threatened, and intimidated him into naming Anthony.
I did not see Anthony Porter shoot anyone. I was threatened, harassed, and intimidated.
With this revelation, they now needed to find the suspected real culprit, Alstory Simon. The only way to reach him was through Inez Jackson. To reach her, they had to get in contact with Walter Jackson, who happened to be her nephew and was serving time at the Danville Correctional Center for first-degree murder. On January 8, 1999, the students visited Walter in prison, where he shared the entire story that he'd been hiding all these years. In 1982, he'd been living with Alstory Simon and Inez Jackson when he was a runaway. On the evening of the crime, he overheard Alstory talking about his plan to meet Jerry Hillard and Marilyn Green. Jerry owed Alstory money for drugs, which Alstory was supplying Jerry to sell. Walter suspected that something bad might happen because of Alstory's strange behavior when he left the apartment that evening. A few hours later, Alstory returned and took Walter aside. He confessed to Walter that he'd taken care of Jerry and Marilyn by shooting them near the bleachers in Washington Park with a .38 caliber revolver. Allstory was scared that Jerry's street gang might retaliate, so he wanted someone to know what had happened. The next day, Allstory told Walter they needed to leave Chicago until things calmed down. They had the story, but they needed to get to Allstory, as well as Inez Jackson, which proved to be a challenge. They thought they were at a dead end. However, the students got a lucky break when they discovered Inez's real name was Margaret Simon. They tracked her down through a close relative and arranged a meeting with her, investigator Cialino, and Professor Protas at a local restaurant in Milwaukee. Margaret revealed that on the evening of the Bud Billiken Parade in 1982, she went to Washington Park with Allstory, Jerry, and Marilyn. Before coming to the park, Allstory had been complaining all day about the money Jerry owed him. He arrived at the park under the influence of marijuana and alcohol. After about 20 minutes, Allstory and Jerry got into an argument about the money. Suddenly, gunshots rang out. Allstory grabbed Margaret and quickly led her away from the bleachers. Margaret couldn't share the truth because Allstory had threatened her life. She signed an affidavit, and the team later recorded her story on video, which was released to CBS News.
And do you realize who shot them?
He did, because he was the only one standing there.
And he is?
Allstory Simon.
With each development, the case introduced new twists, and there were more to come. Cialino traveled to Milwaukee to talk to Allstory Simon about the case. At first, he denied any involvement, but while Cialino was there, they saw Margaret Simon's confession on the news. He realized there was no point hiding it anymore and finally admitted that he shot both Jerry and Marilyn because he thought Jerry was reaching for a gun and he did it to defend himself.
Mr. Simon, directing your attention back to August of 1982, do you know an individual by the name of Jerry Hiller?
Well, I don't know his last name, but I do know Jerry.
Can you tell me how you knew him?
He was a person that was selling drugs for me.
Okay. And while you were in the bleachers, did something else happen?
Yeah, when I started asking him about my finances, he began to get a little loud, and I said, well, man, what the hell has been gotten into you, you know? And then by that time, you know, he said, well, it's on, you know, and then he went down like inside of his shirt, like, you know, like he had a gun or something.
How did he do that, Al?
Yeah, he went down like he had a gun in a shoulder holster. Before I knew anything, you know, like I just pulled it up and started shooting.
Now, what kind of weapon did you have?
I had a .38.
Was it a revolver?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
With this new development, the nightmare was finally over for Anthony Porter, who was still on death row for the crime he never committed. In February 1999, the Cook County State's Attorney filed a motion to release Anthony Porter. Judge Thomas Fitzgerald granted the motion, stating that there were significant evidentiary developments that raised doubts about Anthony's guilt. On February 5, 1999, Anthony Porter was exonerated and was released from prison on bail after 17 long years. When he got out, he immediately went and hugged Professor Protas for all the help he provided.
I'm absolutely thrilled and ecstatic that an innocent man is going to be walking to freedom, and having played some role in that just makes me feel exhilarated.
Anthony alleged that the prison guards subjected him to both physical and mental abuse, and to make things even worse, he discovered crushed cockroaches in his meals.
I got railroaded, tortured.
Anthony Porter's exoneration in March 1999 played a crucial role in changing how Illinois dealt with the death penalty. His case revealed major problems in the state's death penalty system. By that time, Illinois had executed 12 people, but had also released 13 individuals who were wrongfully convicted. In January 2000, Governor George Ryan took a significant step by halting all executions in the state. This marked a turning point in Illinois' approach to capital punishment.
I'm commuting the sentence of all death row inmates. 167 of them.
In the meantime, on September 7, 1999, Allstory Simon pleaded guilty to both murders and received a 37-year prison sentence. But the case was far from being over. There was yet another twist waiting to be unfolded. Years passed. Allstory was in prison, but there was a significant turn of events. In 2005, Inez Jackson, who was very ill and near death, admitted that she and her nephew, Walter, had made up stories to get help from Professor Protas in order to free Inez's own son, Sonny Jackson, and nephew, Walter Jackson, from prison.
But Inez, you never saw Allstory, Simon shoot Marilyn and Jerry, did you?
No.
So if you told the news media that, that would be one of the things that would not be true, right?
Right.
Was there a reason why you continued telling people that you had seen Allstory, Simon shoot and kill Marilyn and Jerry? Is there a reason why you continued doing that?
I was still mad at him.
Okay, and I think you also told us about this conversation where Walter told you that if you helped David Protest free Anthony Porter, that David Protest would help Walter, right?
Right, yes.
Allstory took back his confession too and claimed that he was pressured into making a false statement by two men who pretended to be city police officers. They showed him a fake witness video that framed him for the crime. They promised him a short prison sentence and a movie deal if he confessed. This led to a new investigation which dragged on for about a decade. Amid ongoing accusations, Professor Protas resigned from the university, and in 2014, he became the head of the Chicago Innocence Project. Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez conducted a year-long review of Allstory's case. She dropped the charges against him, ending his 37-year sentence in October 2014, ordering his release from prison after he'd already served 15 years.
As you may know, Mr. Simon had pled guilty to these charges in 1999 in connection with the murders of Jerry Hillard and Marilyn Green, which occurred on August 15, 1982. After pleading guilty to these crimes in 1999, Mr. Simon has been serving his sentence until today. Even though Mr. Simon is due to be released in less than 3 years, justice compels that I take action today. The decision to vacate these convictions comes as a result of a year-long comprehensive investigation into the facts of this case conducted by my Conviction Integrity Unit.
What's up, Al? Hey, what's going on, man? All right. It is today. Yeah. Congratulations, man. Can't believe this happened.
In 2001, Anthony sued the city of Chicago for $24 million, but he lost the case. Allstory then filed a federal civil rights suit against the Northwestern University Innocence Project and received an undisclosed amount as settlement. Anthony Porter struggled to adjust to life after his release. When he was declared innocent by the governor, he received a restitution check for $145,875, a sum far less than what he believed he deserved for his years in prison. Sadly, the money quickly disappeared, spent on a fancy SUV, gifts for friends and supporters, and alcohol. Not long after being freed, he faced an arrest for assaulting his daughter and her mother. However, this time, he was able to avoid jail time. He moved in with his mother and spent most of his days on the couch watching daytime TV. Frustrated, he told a visiting reporter, "All I wanted was to get home. Then I got to go home. I feel like I'm going through the same thing as before. I just want to get a life." Whether or not he ever got a life is just another mystery as the original double murder mystery of 1982. The question of who killed Jerry and Marilyn that night still remains unanswered. The case began with Jerry and Marilyn, but after almost half a century now, to most, except their family, the memory of that young couple's tragic end in Washington Park has faded away. With all the legal twists and turns, wrongful convictions, and changes over the years, it seems like people don't even know who they're supposed to consider victims in the story. This case was like no other we've covered before. But given what we know, who do you think killed Jerry and Marilyn? Who do you think was lying, All-Story Simon or Anthony Porter? Please keep the conversation going in the comment section below.
Eyewitness identification testimony is always problematic because it's highly unreliable.
About 72% of wrongful convictions come from mistaken eyewitness identifications.
I couldn't let someone else's mistake make me waver in my faith and ever make me shy away from what was real and what the truth was, and that was I was innocent, and I knew it.
During that visit, Mr. Jones actually said to the students, I keep getting mistaken for this guy named...
I hope and prayed every day for this day to come, and you know, and when it finally got here, it was an overwhelming feeling.
On October 7th, 1999, 23-year-old Richard Anthony Jones was arrested in his Missouri home for a crime committed at Roland Park, Kansas on May 31st earlier that year. Richard claimed he was innocent and pleaded with detectives to reinvestigate the matter. He specifically alleged that the crime had been committed by someone who looked like him. On May 31st, 1999, a 28-year-old woman named Tamara Scherer was out shopping in one of the popular malls in Roland Park. At around 8 p.m., while walking outside a Walmart store in Roe Boulevard, she was suddenly attacked by a man from behind. He had only one mission, to steal her purse for some quick cash, but Tamara was determined to put up a fight. Tamara managed to yank her bag away from the stranger, but in the tussle, she fell down and hurt her knees. The contents of her bag spilled on the ground, and the thief grabbed her cell phone before running away. Tamara was unable to chase him as her knees were badly scraped from the fall. The thief made his way to a waiting car, which immediately drove off as he entered. Luckily for the woman, a security guard named Ronald Cohen had witnessed the scene. He immediately came to Tamara's aid, and while he couldn't catch the thief, he made sure to memorize the plate number of the getaway car. Tamara approached the police and made a report of the incident. Ronald also gave a statement, claiming to have seen the assailant's vehicle in the parking lot that afternoon. Ronald and Tamara did their best to give a physical description of the attacker, but it had been too dark to see his face properly. Tamara guessed the man was Hispanic or tan-skinned, with thin to medium build and dark hair that was pulled back from his face at the time of the attack. Ronald said the attacker was a Hispanic or black man with a light complexion. Police found another eyewitness, Ron Walters, who had seen the car escaping and chased the vehicle from a distance. He too recalled the license plate number. While Ron couldn't describe the attacker, he said he'd noticed a tattoo on the man's left arm as he got into the car. Using the plate number, detectives were able to trace the vehicle to a used car lot. The owner of the lot said that his son, David Colvin Jr., had been driving the car around on the day of the attack. When interrogated, Colvin Jr. initially denied the story, but when pressed further, it emerged that he had indeed been in the car with a friend named Edward Miller. Both of the boys confessed to being high on crack while they drove around the city. According to their statement, Colvin Jr. and Edward had driven to an apartment complex in Kansas City to procure more drugs, but they were short of money to make the purchase. In their fogged state of mind, they met a man they simply identified as Rick, who had an idea to get some quick cash. Rick joined them in the car and directed them to a Walmart parking lot where they waited for a potential victim to rob. When Tamara came along at 8 p.m., Rick saw his opportunity and went after her. Colvin Jr. and Edward saw him commit the crime and helped him escape right after. However, the boys' accounts of events couldn't be fully trusted as they were high on drugs at the time. So on June 7, 1999, police invited the security guard Ronald to go through a photographic lineup that included Colvin Jr.'s photo. However, Ronald failed to recognize Colvin Jr., leading to a lull in the case. 3 months after the attack, on August 21, 1999, Colvin Jr. faced another round of interrogation by the Kansas City Police Department. He was shown a database of convicted black males in the system with the first name of Rick or Richard. Colvin Jr. paused at the 202nd photograph, identifying that person as the Rick who had attacked Tamara. The picture was that of 23-year-old Richard Anthony Jones, who lived across the Missouri River from Kansas. On August 30, 1999, police created a new photographic lineup that included Richard's photograph. Notably, Richard stood out as the only light-skinned person in the lineup. The others were several shades darker than him. Police showed this lineup to Edward, and like his friend Colvin Jr., he too identified Richard as the purse snatcher. Richard was born in 1976 and lived a very checkered life with multiple run-ins with the law since his teenage years. By the age of 18, he was a convicted felon. He was charged with theft and the sale of steroids in 1994. At the time of the robbery, Richard was living across the state line in Kansas City, Missouri, with his girlfriend, Naisha Duncan. They had 2 daughters, one toddler-aged and the other just a few months old. On October 7, 1999, police showed up at Richard's home and arrested him, despite his claims of being innocent. Instead of minor theft, he was charged with aggravated robbery due to the fact that Tamara had fallen and sustained injury during the attack. On October 21, 1999, Ronald was invited again to view the 6-person lineup that was earlier shown to Colvin Jr. and Edward. Ronald also seemed sure that Richard was the man they were looking for. Months later, at the case's preliminary hearing, Tamara saw Richard in the courtroom and pointed him out as the man who had attacked her on May 31, 1999. Richard's trial began at the Johnson County Circuit Court in April 2001. Tamara and Ronald both testified that Richard was the man who tried to rob her. Oddly, when Colvin Jr. and Edward took the stand, they could not confidently identify him as the man who rode in their car and committed the robbery. Richard denied the claims vehemently, stating he was nowhere near the crime scene that day. He said there'd been a party at his Missouri home on May 31, 1999, to mark Memorial Day and the birthday of his girlfriend, Naisha. Naisha and her sister also testified they were with Richard all day and during the time of the robbery, and guests who attended the party also confirmed having seen Richard at home. But these testimonies didn't sway the jury, who were convinced that Richard was the culprit. His former convictions of theft and steroid sales also likely influenced the trial's outcome. On April 24, 2001, Richard was convicted of aggravated robbery and was sentenced to 19 years in prison, much to the shock of his friends and family. From the moment he got into prison, Richard began making legal efforts to clear his name. In 2003, he officially appealed his conviction, but the Kansas Court of Appeals upheld the original sentence. Richard was undeterred and kept consulting lawyers and family members, requesting them to gather more evidence to prove his innocence. But there is a huge twist awaiting to be revealed, something that people just see in the movies. During his incarceration, Richard began to experience a strange occurrence. Fellow inmates would frequently approach him and call him by another name, Ricky Amos. When Richard clarified they were mistaken, the inmates would be taken aback, swearing that he shared an uncanny resemblance to Ricky, a man who had been in and out of prison. While this piqued his curiosity, Richard had little means to investigate the matter. As the years passed, his optimism dwindled. By 2016, he'd already served most of his sentence and exhausted all legal avenues to challenge his conviction. Richard made one final desperate attempt, which, against all odds, would change his fortunes. In 2016, Richard wrote a letter to the Kansas University School of Law and asked them to consider his case under their Project for Innocence initiative. His letter caught their eye, and they sent a team of law students to meet him. In that first meeting, Richard mentioned that throughout his stay in prison, his fellow inmates had been mistaking him for someone named Ricky Amos. The law students got to work and scoured the Kansas Correctional Database, looking for the name Ricky Amos. What they found was utterly unbelievable. The Correctional Database listed a man named Ricky Lee Amos, whose appearance was so strikingly similar to Richard's that both men could have passed for twins. Their booking photos, when placed side by side, could barely be told apart. They were both light-skinned, with the same pattern of facial hair and the same hairstyle of cornrows. Their physical build was also identical at about 6 feet and 200 pounds. Even their ages were similar, with Ricky being just a year younger to Richard. More importantly, Ricky's last known listed address was around the same area where the 1999 robbery had taken place. Ricky had been living with his mother in the very neighborhood where Colvin Jr. and Edward had described picking him up on the day of the robbery. Records showed that Ricky had been in and out of prison for several different charges, including robbery, drug possession, and battery. At the time of this reinvestigation, he was incarcerated in Sedgwick County Prison in Kansas for failing to register as a sex offender twice. The Project for Innocence team knew this could be Richard's last shot at freedom. They joined forces with the Midwest Innocence Project to build a case for a new trial. They managed to get an affidavit from John Cowles, the initial prosecutor in Richard's case, stating that the new information about Ricky Amos necessitated a review of Richard's case. The information provided to me undermined whatever confidence I had at the time that the trial of Richard Jones resulted in a just result. It's not my place to reach a conclusion that the new information proves Mr. Jones's innocence, but I do believe that it would be appropriate for the Project of Innocence to pursue whatever relief might still be available to Mr. Jones, Cowles said in the affidavit. The initial witnesses were also questioned in a fresh round of investigations. On seeing the pictures of Richard and Rick, they couldn't tell them apart and began to doubt who they'd seen on the night of May 31st, 1999. At last, the witnesses also recounted their identification of Richard. Based on the new evidence, the Project for Innocence filed a post-conviction motion for a new trial in 2017, which was granted. During the trial, Richard's lawyer showed that the lineup that had resulted in Richard's arrest in the first place was faulty. Alice Craig, a lawyer associated with the Project for Innocence who represented Richard, noted that witnesses were presented with a biased lineup when they had no option but to choose Richard. This was because he was the only man who fit the description given by witnesses. Their choices might have turned out differently if other light-skinned or similar-looking men had been included in the lineup. His lawyers also pointed out that Richard did not have any tattoos on his left arm, which contradicted the description given by Ron, the Walmart customer who chased the getaway car after the incident. They emphasized that the two men who claimed to have driven with the culprit were under the influence of drugs at the time, so any evidence given by them regarding the culprit's description lacked weight. With the new evidence and arguments presented in court, Richard waited with bated breath for the decision that could make or mar his life. On June 7, 2017, an evidentiary hearing took place at Johnson County Court. After seeing Ricky at the trial, the initial witnesses agreed they lacked confidence to point out the attacker and walked back on their testimony of Richard being the purse snatcher. Judge Kevin Moriarty, who presided over the case, said, "I have no doubt that a jury would not be able to reach a determination that Richard was guilty, and this court does not believe any reasonable jury could have made such a decision in this case." Ricky was also called to the stand, and he denied any involvement in the case. Unfortunately, the prosecution couldn't begin an investigation against him because by 2017, the statute of limitations for the case had already expired. Hours after the evidentiary hearing, Richard was released to return to his family and start his life afresh. He was all smiles as he walked out of the court as a free man to hug his family and girlfriend Naisha. Not only was he reunited with his daughters after 16 long years, he also met his granddaughter for the first time. Speaking with reporters, Richard said he was happy to be vindicated at last after years of trying to prove his innocence. He especially thanked his friends and family who had all supported him in his quest for justice during his years in prison. Richard's daughter also shared her joy at having her father back in their family.
Yeah, looking forward to it that he's not in there no more, so now you can't get back from the 17 years, but I guess we can move forward from where we didn't get together.
In April 2018, the Compensation for Wrongful Conviction and Imprisonment Act was enacted by the Kansas State Legislature to provide compensation for victims of wrongful convictions in the state. In August 2018, Richard filed a petition under this new law seeking compensation for the years he spent in prison. On December 18, 2018, a district judge granted the petition and Richard was awarded a certificate of innocence. The court also ordered for the expungement of the records of his arrest and conviction, the destruction of any biological samples associated with this case, recommendations for counseling, and the permission to participate in the state health care benefits program for the years 2019 and 2020. To cap it all, he was awarded $1.1 million. While no compensation could give him the years he'd lost, Richard was still happy that his compensation was granted. Unfortunately for Richard, his run-in with law enforcement did not end in 2017. Just 2 years after his release, more troubles came knocking at his door. In 2019, police responded to a domestic disturbance call and found Richard on the scene fighting with someone else. He was also in possession of a handgun, despite being barred from carrying a firearm due to his 1994 conviction. On seeing the police, Richard managed to flee and evade capture. He was finally caught on March 5, 2019, after a dramatic car chase, which ended in him crashing his car and sustaining injuries. On searching the car, police found cocaine, marijuana, and firearms. Richard was arrested and charged for illegally possessing firearms despite his prior felony. At his arraignment on November 14, 2019, Richard pleaded guilty, but there's no information on whether he was convicted of this charge. It's most likely he reached a plea deal with prosecutors before his case could reach trial. What do you think police can do to avoid wrongful convictions? And do you think Richard would have avoided the life of crime if he was given a job instead of money? Please let us know your thoughts. Also, if you have any case suggestions you'd like us to cover, please mention it in the comment section below. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe.